Good evening. Tonight we're not going to talk about famine or plague or the slow, grinding cruelty of some forgotten century. Tonight we're going somewhere that looks, at first glance, like a happy ending. A movie star, a prince, a wedding watched by tens of millions of people. The kind of story that gets printed on the inside of a jewelry box lid. But stay with me, because we're going to walk quietly past the wedding photographs and into the actual rooms where this woman lived out the rest of her life. And what we find back there is not exactly the fairy tale the magazine sold you. Before we start, thank you to everyone who keeps leaving suggestions in the comments. This particular story came from one of you, and putting it together was genuinely one of the more interesting projects this channel has done. If you're new here, this channel exists to help you fall asleep to long, calm, detailed history. So get comfortable, dim the lights, maybe put on a fan or a heater for that background hum, and let your body know it's time to slow down. If you'd like the audio-only version for Spotify, it's linked below, and members get access to an extended ad-free cut for the nights when even 4 hours isn't enough. Now let's ease into tonight's subject with a few questions, the way we always do. Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to walk away from the best job you'd ever have, right at the exact moment you finally mastered it? Have you ever tried to imagine marrying someone you had spent, in total, only a handful of days with, in front of an audience of millions? What would it be like to know that your body, your ability to have children, was being quietly discussed as a matter of national survival? Could you sit through a formal dinner in a language you'd only started learning months earlier, surrounded by people who were still deciding whether they liked you? And what happens to a fairy tale once the wedding is over and you discover that palaces have cold floors, husbands have tempers and crowns, physically, way more than you'd think? We're going to spend the next several hours finding out. So settle back, because our story begins on an ordinary spring day in the south of France, with a young actress who almost turned down a magazine assignment she didn't particularly want to do, with absolutely no idea that the assignment was about to rewrite the rest of her life. Here is the story most people already know, in outline. American movie star travels to Europe, meets a prince, falls in love, marries him in a grand cathedral, and disappears into a palace on a cliff over the sea, presumably to live happily ever after among warm breezes and yacht parties. It's one of the most retold love stories of the 20th century, repeated so often that nobody ever really stops to check what happened after the credits rolled. And that's usually how these stories survive, not because they're true, but because nobody bothers to follow up. The truth is stranger and lonelier and considerably more human than the postcard version. Grace Kelly really did marry a prince. She really did get the palace, the title, the cliff, the sea, the whole glittering package. What she didn't get was any kind of instruction manual, any real preparation, or in the end, very much say in how her life would actually be run once the cameras packed up and went home. Tonight we're going to look underneath the gold leaf and see what was actually there. Fairy tales, as a rule, stop at the wedding. The music swells, the couple kisses, the credits roll, and the audience is left to assume everything after that point runs smoothly forever. Real lives are stubborn. They keep going long after the ceremony ends, and they keep going in all the unglamorous ways no storybook ever bothers to record. Nobody writes a chapter about learning a foreign language fast enough to survive a state dinner. Nobody writes a chapter about a marriage negotiated partly through lawyers. Grace Kelly's real story had a great deal of material that never made it into the official narrative, and most of that material happened after she said, "I do." She wasn't a passive figure drifting toward happiness. She was a disciplined, sharp, extraordinarily successful professional who made a very deliberate decision to leave the top of one industry for what may be the single most restrictive job a person can hold in the modern world: full-time monarchy. Picture being the most sought-after person in your entire field, at the very height of your career, and then voluntarily choosing a role where your central duties are to look composed at all times, produce an air, and never, under any circumstances, generate a scandal. It is an unusual kind of promotion. You gain a title and lose the freedom to have a bad day in public. The popular version of her story insists she simply got everything she ever wanted. The more honest version is that she received a great many things she never specifically asked for, layered on top of the things she did want. Yes, she got glamour, wealth, and the adoration of an entire country. She also got homesickness she rarely showed the cameras, isolation inside a court that didn't fully trust her at first, a tiny nation whose survival was briefly in real doubt on her watch, and a permanent global audience that felt entitled to comment on her weight, her wardrobe, and her every expression. Fairy tales never mention the audience. They assume the girl gets to stop performing the moment the prince arrives. Grace never really got to stop. What makes her story worth staying awake for a little while longer is exactly that gap, the space between the postcard and the actual person standing inside it. The world wanted a symbol, and for nearly 3 decades she gave them one, flawlessly, night after night, gala after gala. But a symbol is a kind of costume. Underneath it was a real woman, dry-humored, quietly stubborn, homesick more often than anyone realized, and shaped by a demanding Philadelphia family that never made anything easy for her. Over these next several hours, we're going to walk through her actual life, not the fairy tale summary, but the version that includes the loneliness, the political crises, the family friction, and the strange, very human bargain she made the day she decided a crown might be worth more to her than a film career. So let go of the soft focus version for now. As we'll see, the wedding was, if anything, the least interesting part of what happened to her. Long before she was anyone's princess, Grace Kelly was already one of the most in-demand actresses in Hollywood, and she had reached that position with remarkable speed. In only a handful of years, she had gone from a poised, well-raised young woman out of Philadelphia to an Academy Award winner who had worked alongside some of the biggest leading men in the business, and who had become the trusted favorite of a director who rarely trusted anyone, Alfred Hitchcock. She projected cool composure, a kind of luminous self-possession, and this matters for understanding what she gave up. She was, at that exact moment, standing at the very peak of her profession. This was not a fading star looking for a graceful exit. This was a woman walking away from a mountain she had only just finished climbing. To understand the scale of that decision, you have to understand where she came from. She was born into money, the daughter of a self-made, famously demanding father who had built a considerable fortune in the construction business and ran his household somewhat like an athletic training camp. Excellence wasn't encouraged in the Kelly family. It was assumed. So when young Grace announced she wanted to become an actress, her family treated the idea the way many families of that era treated show business, as something only slightly more respectable than running off with a traveling circus. She responded the way stubborn overachievers tend to respond to a skeptical parent. She got extremely good at it, and quickly. Within just a few years, she had moved from stage work and live television into the very center of the film industry. She held her own opposite a weathered, reluctant Gary Cooper in a tense Western standoff. She spent a Hitchcock thriller trapped in an apartment, watching her neighbors through a rear window, helpless to intervene in what she was certain was a murder. She traded sharp, flirtatious dialogue with Cary Grant along the French Riviera in a jewel thief caper. And then, stepping entirely away from glamour, she played an exhausted, emotionally worn-down wife in a drama that finally won her the Academy Award for Best Actress. In industry terms, she had assembled a full trophy case before most performers manage a single shelf. And she had built something rarer than talent: mystique. She was the very definition of cool, composed elegance, the kind of face that looked like it was keeping a secret worth knowing. Directors wanted her. Audiences trusted her instantly. The press could never get quite enough of her. In modern terms, she was the actress whose name alone could get a project financed, the face that guaranteed magazine sales. If she'd simply kept working, she could easily have coasted on that reputation for another decade or two. Which is exactly what makes the choice she made next so remarkable. Nobody pushed her out. There was no scandal, no string of failed films, no fatting box office appeal. She was standing at the summit, with the entire industry laid out beneath her, and she looked at all of it and quietly began wondering whether she wanted something else entirely. Part of it was simple exhaustion with the machinery of studio life. The contracts, the control the studios exerted over an actress's schedule, image, and personal choices. Part of it was a longing she rarely spoke about publicly, for stability, for a family, for a role that couldn't simply be handed to a younger actress the moment she turned 35. So when an entirely unexpected offer arrived from across the ocean, it landed on a woman who was already, privately, questioning whether the mountain she'd worked so hard to climb was actually the one she wanted to spend her life standing on. Most people spend their whole lives trying to reach the top of something. Grace reached it early, looked around, and quietly began considering the exit. It just so happened that the exit was shaped like a crown. The meeting that would eventually change the entire shape of her life arrived disguised as a minor work assignment, one she very nearly turned down. In the spring of 1955, Grace was in the south of France for the Cannes Film Festival when a magazine arranged a photo opportunity for her. A visit to the Prince of Monaco at his palace to pose for a few pictures that would run alongside festival coverage. On paper, it was nothing special. In practice, the day itself unfolded like a small, slow-motion disaster. There was a power outage at her hotel, which meant no way to properly iron her clothes. She ended up dressing in a printed floral outfit that was far from the sleek, considered look she would normally have chosen for meeting a head of state. Then came a long, hot drive up the coast toward Monaco on winding roads, under time pressure, in the kind of heat that makes every delay feel personal. When she finally arrived at the palace, the prince himself was not there to greet her. He was running late. So the most famous young actress in the world sat and waited for a monarch who had not yet bothered to show up, presumably wondering more than once why she had agreed to any of this in the first place. When Prince Rainier III finally appeared, the meeting itself was polite, slightly formal, entirely proper. He walked her through the palace grounds, and in a detail that sounds almost too whimsical to be true, showed her the private zoo he kept on the property, introducing her to some of the animals himself. Nothing about the afternoon suggested history was being made. It felt, by every account, like a pleasant but unremarkable visit with a courteous stranger. But that, it turns out, is often exactly how enormous things begin quietly, disguised as something ordinary. There was no orchestral swell, no thunderclap of instant romance. What existed instead was a careful, well-mannered curiosity between two people sizing each other up without quite admitting that's what they were doing. Rainier was serious, guarded, a man who had spent his entire adult life as the head of a small state and carried that responsibility visibly in his posture and manner. Grace was warm, observant, and thanks to a lifetime of scrutiny in front of cameras, extremely skilled at reading a room within seconds of entering it. To Grace, at the time, this was simply an unusual detour in a busy festival schedule, a photo shoot, a courtesy visit, nothing more. To history, looking backward, it was the opening scene of one of the most closely watched partnerships of the century. The photographs taken that afternoon would later seem almost absurdly significant. Two people standing together in a palace garden with no idea that the rest of their lives were already quietly leaning into place around them. They parted without any dramatic gesture. Grace returned to the whirlwind of premieres, photographers, and studio obligations that made up her ordinary working life. Rainier returned to the daily business of running his small but proud principality, and to a pressing, very personal concern, the future of his own family line, and what would happen to his country if he failed to secure it. And then, in the weeks that followed, letters began crossing the Atlantic, formal at first, careful, gradually building into something neither the heat, nor the power outage, nor the wilted floral dress, nor the late arrival of a prince had managed to prevent. Sometimes the most important day of an entire life shows up looking in the moment like a fairly bad one What followed the letters was less a sweeping romance and more a swift, businesslike negotiation, dressed up in the language of courtship. After months of correspondence conducted almost entirely on paper, Prince Rainier traveled to the United States that winter, spent only a matter of days in Grace's actual physical company, met her family, and proposed marriage. It was romantic, certainly. The affection between them, by every account, was genuine. But it was also, unmistakably, a transaction and not a small one. Monaco was a tiny principality that badly needed a compelling reason for the world to keep paying attention to it, and needed, even more urgently, an heir to secure its future. Grace, remarkably, satisfied both requirements at once. There was, famously, the delicate matter of a dowry, a detail modern retellings tend to quietly leave out, because it doesn't fit comfortably inside the fairy tale. The affection was real. So was the paperwork. In the marriage of a Hollywood star and a reigning monarch, it turned out, love and financial negotiation were never quite permitted to occupy separate rooms. By the time Rainier arrived in the United States around the Christmas season of 1955, the two of them had built something substantial out of nothing more than letters, ink, and the patience required to wait for transatlantic mail. But the actual, in-person courtship, the part where two people confirm they genuinely want to spend their lives together, had been remarkably brief. They had spent only a handful of days together in person before he proposed marriage. By almost any modern standard, this is the rough equivalent of becoming engaged after a few promising dates and months of careful letter writing. Rainier also had to meet the family, which meant meeting Jack Kelly, Grace's formidable and famously demanding father, a man not easily impressed by anyone, titled or otherwise. The Kellys were wealthy, proud, entirely self-made, and not remotely inclined to be dazzled simply because a title had walked through their front door. This is where the storybook version of events grows noticeably uncomfortable, because securing the marriage did in fact involve a substantial exchange of money. A dowry was expected, the sum was significant, and the negotiations surrounding it were handled with the same businesslike precision Jack Kelly brought to any major transaction. Somewhere inside the romance, in other words, there was also a spreadsheet. None of this is meant to suggest the affection between Grace and Rainier was somehow false. By every available account, it was sincere, but it existed inside a larger machine built entirely out of obligation, and that machine had very specific requirements. Monaco was not simply acquiring a beautiful, charming bride. It was acquiring, in practical terms, the most photographed face on the planet, a public relations triumph beyond easy calculation, arriving at precisely the moment the tiny principality needed the world to remember it existed. And Rainier personally needed something even more fundamental than international attention. He needed a legitimate heir. This detail mattered more than almost anything else in the entire arrangement. Under long-standing treaty terms between Monaco and France, if Rainier died without producing a legitimate heir, the principality risked losing its independent sovereignty altogether, potentially being absorbed into France. In plain terms, the survival of an entire nation was tied directly to whether or not the prince successfully produced a child. So this marriage, for all its genuine romantic elements, was simultaneously a matter of dynastic and national necessity. Grace was not simply being asked to become someone's wife. She was being asked, quite literally, to guarantee the continued existence of a country on something resembling a biological deadline. She said yes anyway, clear-eyed, sharp as ever, fully aware that she was agreeing to considerably more than a husband. The engagement was announced publicly, and the world more or less lost its collective mind. An American film star and a European prince. It was too perfect a story, too cinematic, too easily marketable to be anything other than an instant global sensation. The press descended. The public swooned. Publicity machines on both sides of the Atlantic roared into motion simultaneously. The so-called wedding of the century was officially on the calendar. All it had cost so far was a dowry, a flourishing film career, and any remaining illusion that royal marriages are arranged purely for love. To actually become Princess of Monaco, Grace first had to stop being Grace Kelly, movie star, and the terms of that transition were absolute. There would be no more films, full stop. Her studio, MGM, still held her under contract, and untangling that arrangement became its own small, quietly tense drama behind the scenes. But the larger, harder truth was simpler than any contract dispute. A woman who had just won an Academy Award was retiring from acting at the age of 26, at the very height of her creative and commercial power, and she would not be returning. Her final film wrapped production. Her belongings were packed. An entire imagined future, years of scripts, roles, collaborations, was quietly folded up and set permanently on a shelf. She would spend the remainder of her life being watched by more people, collectively, than any single film could ever hope to reach. And she would also never again be handed a script that allowed her to become, temporarily, someone other than herself. Sit with the scale of that decision for a moment, because it is genuinely staggering. Most performers would sacrifice a great deal to be standing exactly where she stood, awards in hand, offers pouring in, the most productive years of her career still clearly ahead of her. She walked away from all of it before her 27th birthday. Picture, in modern terms, the most celebrated actor of a given year announcing full retirement from the screen, the same season they won their first major award, and never appearing in another film again. It would dominate headlines for months. In 1956, it simply broke a great many hearts across the film industry, quietly and all at once. There was, naturally, the practical matter of the studio contract to resolve. Studios of that era effectively owned their stars in a way that looks almost feudal by modern standards, controlling casting, image, and public behavior with an iron grip. MGM did not simply wave her off with warm wishes. But the studio was nothing if not commercially shrewd, and it found a way to extract one final piece of value from the arrangement, securing the rights to film the wedding itself. If Hollywood was losing its brightest star to a European throne, the studio reasoned, it would at least walk away with one spectacular final production. One where, for once, she wouldn't have to act at all. Her last completed film, a glittering musical comedy shot before the wedding and released afterward, meant audiences got to see her on-screen one final time even as she was, in real life, already transitioning into royalty. It created a strange, brief overlap, the actress and the princess technically existing at the same time, the past and the future briefly sharing a single face on movie screens across the country. And then the door closed, quietly and for good. What she was actually giving up went considerably deeper than fame or income. Acting had been her rebellion, her proof of competence, the very thing she had fought her skeptical family to pursue, and then mastered entirely on her own terms. It was the one arena in which she had been completely, undeniably in control of who she got to become. On screen she could be a thief, a witness, a devoted wife, a schemer, a heroine. She could try on entire lives and then simply hand them back at the end of a shoot. From this point forward, she would have exactly one role for the rest of her life, with no wrap date and absolutely no possibility of ever being recast. Princess of Monaco performed essentially around the clock, in front of the largest and least forgiving audience imaginable, with some of the harshest critics being the very people who claimed to love her most. She closed the door on Hollywood with the same effortless composure she brought to everything else in her public life. But it was a door that, once shut, would not reopen, no matter how much, in certain quiet and lonely years still to come, she might privately wish that it could. Some people retire from a job they loved. Grace traded hers for a crown, and would spend the rest of her life never fully knowing which one she actually preferred. There were, in the end, two separate weddings, because a union carrying this much weight could not reasonably be entrusted to a single ceremony. The first was a civil wedding, held inside the palace in April of 1956, a strictly legal affair, conducted entirely in French, complete with a formal reading of dozens of new titles now attached to Grace's name. Still very much in the process of learning the language, she sat through an extended recitation of honors and territories she had, in most cases, never even heard of that same morning. It was solemn. It was official. And by nearly every account, it was faintly overwhelming. She was no longer simply marrying a man. She was being formally installed into a role, a household, and an entire nation, one carefully worded legal clause at a time. The ceremony took place in the palace throne room, a space of gilded splendor and centuries of accumulated grandeur, the kind of room that makes ordinary furniture look faintly embarrassed by comparison. This was the wedding that legally counted, the moment the paperwork made official what the engagement had merely promised. Monaco had formally acquired its new princess. And because it was Monaco, and because it involved royalty, nothing about the process was allowed to be simple. Where an ordinary couple might sign a license and go find lunch somewhere quiet, Grace sat through an elaborate legal ritual delivered entirely in a language she was, quite literally, still taking daily lessons in. Picture the strangeness of it. An official reading allowed a long, formal catalog of titles now technically hers. Duchess of one territory, Marchioness of another, Countess of some small holding she could not have located on a map if her life depended on it. On that single day, Grace Kelly of Philadelphia accumulated more than 100 separate titles, an avalanche of nobility descending all at once onto a young woman who, roughly a year earlier, had been reading film scripts in California. It felt less like a wedding and more like being handed the keys to an enormous, complicated, centuries-old inheritance while an entire room watched carefully to see whether she would drop anything. She did not. Composure, it turned out, was practically her native language, even when French quite literally was not. She sat through the entire recitation with visible, steady poise, absorbing an entirely new identity being layered onto her, legal clause by legal clause. But the sheer administrative scale of the moment must have been genuinely surreal underneath the calm exterior. Most brides worry, at most, about flowers and a seating chart. Grace was being legally merged into a 700-year-old ruling dynasty in front of government officials, family members, and an ever-present bank of cameras. And the cameras really were always present. Even this comparatively private legal ceremony became a matter of intense international interest, photographed and documented in detail, because the world had already quietly decided that this particular wedding belonged to everyone, not merely to the two people standing at its center. There is a specific kind of pressure that comes from having your most personal, legally binding moments treated as public property, and Grace was receiving an early, thorough education in exactly that pressure. Her marriage was never going to be entirely hers. It belonged in some real sense to Monaco, to the press, to a global public that felt it had a stake in how the story unfolded, a shared possession she simply happened to be standing in the middle of. By the end of the civil ceremony, the matter was legally settled. On paper, in the eyes of the state, she was now the wife of the sovereign prince and an official princess of the realm. It should, by any reasonable measure, have felt like the finish line. Instead, by all accounts, it felt more like the first overwhelming day at a demanding new job, one where the orientation had been conducted entirely in a foreign language, and where the employee handbook appeared to have been written sometime in the 13th century. And she still wasn't finished, because a wedding this legally significant still required something the paperwork alone could never provide: a spectacle grand enough for an audience of roughly 30 million people. The lawyers had already had their turn. The next day belonged entirely to the cathedral, the cameras, and the dress. The following morning belonged to the ceremony the world would actually remember for the rest of the century: the religious wedding, held at the Cathedral of St. Nicholas in Monaco, watched by an estimated 30 million people on live television, a number almost unheard of for that era of broadcasting technology. To put that figure in perspective, television itself was still a relatively young medium in most American and European households in 1956. Many families had only recently acquired a set, And yet an audience of that staggering size gathered around flickering black and white screens to watch two people they had never met exchange vows in a language most of them didn't speak, in a country most of them couldn't have pointed to on a map. That is the sheer gravitational pull this story had already acquired in less than a year. The dress worn that day has, in the decades since, become something close to legendary in its own right, a subject discussed by fashion historians with the same seriousness usually reserved for major artistic movements. It was created by the costume designers at the studio that had once employed her, MGM, arranged as something between a professional courtesy and a farewell gift. Constructed from yards of antique lace, silk, and painstaking hand detailing, it was demure without being plain, regal without tipping into excess, and finished with the kind of quiet perfection that only becomes more impressive the longer you look at it. In the years that followed, it would go on to influence bridal fashion for generations, quietly echoed by countless brides who likely had no idea they were, in some small way, borrowing from a princess. When people today picture the platonic ideal of an elegant wedding dress, some fragment of that mental image very often traces directly back to this particular morning in Monaco. It is worth pausing here to note just how unusual that kind of lasting cultural influence really is. Plenty of royal weddings have produced beautiful dresses. Very few have produced a template that fashion designers are still, decades later, consciously referencing. Inside the cathedral, the guest list represented an almost surreal collision of two entirely separate worlds. European royalty and centuries-old aristocratic families sat shoulder to shoulder with Hollywood actors, studio executives, and international dignitaries. The old world and the new world, crammed together into the same wooden pews, all of them gathered to witness a marriage that had, in its own strange way, merged those two worlds permanently into one shared cultural moment. It was a room absolutely full of some of the most photographed people alive at that moment in history, and for once, every single one of them was seated in the audience rather than standing at the center of attention. And through all of it, Grace performed the one role she could never fully rehearse in advance: herself, getting married, calmly and gracefully, while an ocean of total strangers watched her make the most intimate promise a person can make to another human being. There is something quietly cruel buried inside that image if you sit with it for a moment. A wedding day is supposed to be the one day you belong most completely to a single other person. Hers, in a very real sense, belonged simultaneously to 30 million people she would never personally meet. She promised her life to Rainier while standing, functionally, on the largest stage that had ever been assembled for a single private moment, without the option of a single truly unobserved second. She managed it beautifully, of course. Poise under pressure was a skill she had spent her entire professional career refining, first on sound stages and then increasingly in front of the world's cameras, and never before had that particular skill been tested quite this thoroughly. She recited her vows steadily. She wore the now legendary dress with total, unshakable composure. She embodied, down to the smallest visible detail, exactly the fairy tale the watching world had ordered, as if from a menu. Then she walked out of that cathedral and directly into the rest of her life, and as far as the general public was concerned, the fairy tale was now officially complete. The prince had secured his princess. The story appeared to have reached its natural, satisfying conclusion, except, of course, it was nothing of the sort. It wasn't an ending at all. The television cameras would eventually pack up their equipment and depart. The international press would move on to the next headline, and Grace would remain behind, living in an actual palace built on an actual rock, standing at the very beginning of the part of the story that nobody had thought to film. After a honeymoon spent largely at sea, Grace finally arrived to begin her real, everyday life in Monaco, and it's exactly here that the fairy tale quietly begins to change texture. Monaco was, without question, beautiful, all sun-bleached stone, dazzling coastline and Mediterranean light. But it was also small, genuinely, almost startlingly small, and it was deeply, comfortably set in its own long-established ways, run by people whose families had been managing its affairs for generations before an American actress ever set foot on its soil. The palace itself sat perched on a fortified rocky outcrop overlooking the harbor, a promontory the locals simply referred to, with the casual familiarity of people who had grown up beneath it, as the Rock. Inside its ancient walls waited an entire household staff, a dense and unforgiving calendar of official duties, and a royal court that had been operating smoothly, according to its own internal logic, long before Grace's arrival ever disrupted its rhythms. There was no gentle easing-in period, no grace period during which minor mistakes might be quietly overlooked. From her very first days in residence, she was expected to be flawless, warm, endlessly composed, and permanently on display, all while living in a place where she knew almost no one personally, and where a great many people had already formed firm private opinions about whether she truly belonged there at all. The honeymoon itself, in the days immediately following the cathedral wedding, had consisted of an extended cruise aboard the prince's yacht through the Mediterranean, a floating stretch of relative privacy sandwiched neatly between the wedding and the reality that would follow it. But even this supposedly private interlude was closely watched, trailed at a curious distance by photographers in small boats hopping for a usable shot, a fairly clear preview of the sustained surveillance that would come to define the years ahead. Eventually, inevitably, the cruise ended, as all honeymoons eventually do, and the yacht delivered her to her actual permanent home, at which point the vacation portion of the fairy tale was decisively, unambiguously over. The palace on the rock was, by any reasonable measure, magnificent, a centuries-old fortress gradually converted into a working royal residence, sitting high above the harbor with views genuinely capable of stopping visitors mid-sentence. But magnificence and comfort, as anyone who has ever lived inside an old, grand building quickly discovers, are not remotely the same thing. Ancient palaces tend to be drafty. They tend to echo strangely at night. They tend to be staffed by people who have their own long-established, deeply set ways of doing absolutely everything, methods refined over years or even generations, methods that do not bend easily simply because a new resident has arrived from abroad. And those staff members were now, in a very real sense, simultaneously her servants and her quiet judges, carefully watching to see whether the American newcomer actually measured up to the role she had married into. That was the part no honeymoon cruise, however luxurious, could possibly have prepared her for. She was walking directly into an existing institution, a functioning court complete with its own internal hierarchy, its own customs, its own long-simmering rivalries, and its own very specific expectations, all of them firmly in place long before she had ever set foot in the country. She was, by definition, the newcomer, the outsider, the foreigner who had swept in, quite suddenly, and married the prince everyone else had known their entire lives. And not everyone in Monaco was especially delighted about that arrangement. There were people within the court who quietly doubted her suitability for the role, who privately wondered whether a former Hollywood actress could possibly grasp the dignity and gravity the position demanded, who measured her every gesture against some unspoken, invisible standard of how a proper princess was supposed to carry herself. She had to win these people over gradually, all while learning, essentially in real time and without any real rehearsal period, an entirely new life from the ground up. There was no gentle onboarding process, no forgiving probationary period during which early mistakes might be quietly excused as understandable growing pains. From her very first day, she was fully and completely the Princess of Monaco, and the court, the country, and the wider watching world were all paying close attention to see exactly how she would carry that weight. The pressure to appear flawless was immediate and total. A single wrong word, an ungraceful pause, even a fleeting flash of the homesickness she surely felt in those early weeks, any of it risked becoming a story, a source of doubt, a visible crack in the carefully constructed image. So she did precisely what she had always done when faced with a difficult new challenge. She studied. She observed quietly from the sidelines before acting. She applied that same famous, disciplined work ethic to the enormous task of becoming, as convincingly and as quickly as possible, exactly who this new role required her to be. She learned the daily rhythms of palace life, memorized names and titles and unspoken customs, absorbed the full weight of her new responsibilities with the quiet intensity of someone who had never once, in her entire adult life, been permitted to fail in front of an audience. But underneath that outward composure, she was, in every meaningful sense, very far from home, situated on a small rock in the middle of the sea, surrounded largely by strangers, married into a life she was still only beginning to fully understand. The confetti from the wedding had long since been swept away. The television cameras, in a sense, never really left. And the real, unglamorous, often genuinely lonely work of actually being a princess, as opposed to simply looking like one for a single televised afternoon, was only just beginning. Welcome, in other words, to the rock. The view, everyone agreed, was spectacular. The walls, as she would soon come to learn very intimately, were extremely old and extremely unforgiving of anyone who didn't yet know their way around them. To really understand the world Grace had just married into, it helps to understand just how genuinely small her new kingdom actually was. Monaco was, and remains today, one of the tiniest sovereign states anywhere on Earth, a narrow sliver of coastline you could comfortably walk across in a single unhurried afternoon, famous chiefly for exactly two things: its casino, and the wealthy visitors who came from all over the world to spend money inside it. Its economic fortunes had long risen and fallen in rhythm with the roulette wheels of Monte Carlo. This was the realm Grace now technically presided over as princess, a glamorous, sun-drenched little principality that survived, quite literally, on tourism, favorable tax arrangements, and a carefully maintained international reputation. For a woman who had grown up in a large American city and then spent her working life inside the vast, sprawling machinery of the Hollywood studio system, the sheer scale of her new home must have felt less like inheriting a kingdom, and more like moving into a very ornate, very closely watched small town, one where she happened to be, by a wide margin, the single most famous resident. The numbers involved are almost comically small when you actually sit with them. Monaco is compact enough that it would fit, with considerable room left over, inside a single large city park in many American cities. It is the sort of country you could realistically walk from one end to the other before lunchtime, and still have plenty of time afterward to sit down somewhere and complain about your feet. There are individual neighborhoods within ordinary mid-sized cities that cover more physical ground than the entire sovereign nation of Monaco. And yet this tiny sliver of Mediterranean coastline was, and is, a fully independent sovereign state, complete with its own ruling family, its own centuries of tradition, and its own fiercely defended sense of independence. A nation punching so far above its actual physical weight that the entire world had just spent a full day watching its royal wedding unfold on live television. Its wealth came from neither farmland nor factories, because there was, quite simply, no available room for either. It came instead from something considerably more glamorous and considerably more fragile: the casino at Monte Carlo. That casino had built the principality's modern fortune on gambling, luxury tourism, and a steady, reliable stream of wealthy visitors willing to lose money elegantly beneath chandeliers, in an atmosphere designed specifically to make losing feel almost aspirational. The company that operated the casino, and by extension much of the principality's broader business activity, functioned as the effective financial heartbeat of the entire state. In very practical terms, Grace had married into a country whose economy depended at its core on roulette wheels and the enduring willingness of the extremely rich to be parted from a portion of their fortune, gracefully and repeatedly. This arrangement gave the whole principality a curious kind of double character. On the surface, It was pure enchantment, yachts crowding the harbor, sunlight glinting off the water, the perfumed, unhurried glamour of the very wealthy at leisure. But underneath that surface sat a genuinely small, genuinely exposed enterprise, dependent entirely on maintaining a certain image, on continued tourism, and on the ongoing goodwill of far larger and more powerful neighboring countries in order to keep functioning at all. Its glamour wasn't simply decoration. Its glamour was, quite literally, the entire business model. If Monaco ever stopped feeling magical to visitors, it would very quickly stop being profitable. And if it stopped being profitable, the principality itself would be in genuine, immediate danger, which is precisely where Grace came into the larger equation, whether she had fully grasped it herself in those early days or not. She wasn't simply a new wife and a new princess. She had, almost overnight, become the single most valuable piece of publicity the tiny principality had ever managed to acquire. Her face, her fame, her already mythologized love story, all of it drew sustained global attention toward a place that depended entirely on sustained attention in order to survive economically. In marrying her, Monaco had effectively acquired the most famous spokesperson on the entire planet, and a significant part of her new, unofficial job description was simply to exist beautifully and visibly enough to keep the whole glittering enterprise appealing, and therefore solvent. For Grace personally, the sheer intimacy of scale must have taken real getting used to. In Hollywood, she had been one exceptionally bright star among many, part of an enormous constellation of talent, one name among hundreds on studio contracts. Here in Monaco, she was effectively the sun around which a very small world quietly orbited. Everyone in the principality knew her by sight. Everyone watched her every public move with genuine, sustained interest. There was no meaningful anonymity available anywhere within these borders, no crowd large enough to simply disappear into for even a few private minutes. She was the central attraction in a kingdom small enough to cross entirely on foot. It amounted, in the end, to an extraordinarily grand life lived inside an extraordinarily small physical space. And small spaces, as she would gradually come to learn, have their own particular way of slowly closing in around a person over time. Grace had not simply married an individual man. She had married directly into an entire dynasty, and one of the oldest continuously ruling families anywhere in Europe. The House of Grimaldi had governed Monaco for roughly 7 consecutive centuries, a family history built from clever political alliances, narrow escapes from larger predatory neighbors, and a stubborn, almost defiant talent for survival against powers many times its size. To join this family was to inherit not merely a title, but an entire lineage, a dense set of inherited expectations, and a very long list of ancestors whose reputations she was now, in a sense, personally responsible for upholding. There were traditions she was expected to honor without hesitation or question, and a centuries-old family reputation she was now personally entrusted with maintaining. The Grimaldis had endured for hundreds of years precisely because they took the matter of their own continuation extremely seriously, generation after generation. Grace, the newcomer from across the Atlantic, was now expected to help ensure that continuity carried forward, and to do so, ideally, with a warm and reassuring public smile the entire time. The origin story of the dynasty itself is the sort of tale that would seem wildly overwritten in a screenplay, and yet it happens to be genuinely true. Centuries earlier, the family had first seized control of the rock through a legendary act of disguise and calculated daring. A founding ancestor famously slipping past the fortress's defenses dressed as a humble monk, before drawing a concealed blade once safely inside. That founding act of clever deception was considered so central to the family's entire identity that it was permanently stitched into their official coat of arms. 2 armed monks, swords drawn, a lasting visual reminder that this particular dynasty began with audacity, and by most accounts, never entirely lost its taste for it. 700 years is an almost genuinely difficult stretch of time to comprehend. To put it in useful perspective, the Grimaldis had been continuously ruling their small stretch of rocky coastline since long before most of today's recognizable nation-states existed in anything resembling their current form. They had personally watched entire empires rise and then collapse around them. They had survived wars, revolutions, foreign occupations, and repeated existential threats to their sovereignty, and had somehow, time after time, managed to claw their way back to full independent control over their small patch of Mediterranean coastline. Endurance wasn't simply part of their history. It was, in every meaningful sense, their entire brand identity. Marrying into that kind of continuity meant absorbing an enormous, largely unspoken weight of expectation. Grace was not the beginning of anything new. She was instead the newest single link in a chain stretching backward through the fog of medieval European history, and everyone around her at court was acutely, sometimes uncomfortably aware of the difference between an authentic, born Grimaldi and a recently arrived American film actress who had simply married into the name. She was expected to understand centuries of tradition, respect an elaborate set of formal protocols, and behave, in essentially every public moment, in a manner genuinely worthy of a lineage that predated the founding of her own home country by several hundred years. The bar wasn't merely set high. The bar, in a very real sense, had been set sometime during the Middle Ages, and the ongoing survival of the entire dynasty now rested, quite literally, on the next generation, which made Grace's specific role within the family uncomfortably, unavoidably specific. This was a family that had survived for 7 centuries in part by never once failing to produce an heir at precisely the moment one was needed most. The entire multi-century story could, at least in theory, come apart entirely if the family line was allowed to end, and continuing that line had now become, quite explicitly, her personal responsibility. She had married directly into living history, and history itself, in a real sense, was now watching closely to see whether she would successfully keep it going. There was pressure built into that reality, obviously, but there was also, undeniably, a certain strange grandeur to it. She had traveled, in the space of only a few years, from being the daughter of a self-made American businessman to becoming the personal guardian of one of Europe's most ancient and storied royal houses. The young woman whose own family had once regarded acting as barely respectable was now personally entrusted with securing the future of a dynasty considerably older than most of the world's modern nations. Even her demanding father, by any reasonable measure, would have struggled to top an achievement of that particular scale. But dynasties, as a rule, do not concern themselves with anyone's personal feelings, and they do not offer sabbaticals. They care, fundamentally, about continuity, dignity, and the reliable production of the next generation. Grace, characteristically, understood the assignment clearly and completely. She had married the man, yes, but in doing so, she had also quietly signed on to 7 centuries of accumulated survival, and the Grimaldis, historically speaking, had never once been in the habit of allowing their own story to simply end. The next chapter, everyone around her made unmistakably clear, would ultimately be written in the palace nursery. The prince's palace itself was, without question, magnificent, and it was also, in the plain and unavoidable daily sense, now simply her home, which meant learning, gradually and sometimes painfully, how to actually live inside what amounted to a functioning historical monument. There were centuries-old formal rooms, priceless inherited furnishings, and long stone corridors staffed around the clock by people whose entire job description involved quietly observing court protocol at every hour of the day and night. Privacy, the ordinary, unremarkable kind most people take entirely for granted in their own homes, became, almost overnight, an extremely scarce and precious commodity. Meals were formal, structured occasions with their own established rules. Daily schedules were carefully managed by household staff. Even leisure time, in this environment, came with an implied shape and an implied audience. Grace, practical and quietly determined as ever, set about the slow work of making small pockets of the enormous palace feel genuinely lived in, softening the overwhelming grandeur wherever she reasonably could. But a working palace, as she gradually discovered, is simply not the same thing as an ordinary house, and she would spend years quietly negotiating the strange, persistent gap between technically owning one of the most beautiful residences on Earth and simply wanting, on any given evening, somewhere comfortable enough to fully relax. The trouble with actually living inside a monument, it turns out, is that monuments were never really designed with day-to-day living in mind. They were designed to impress visitors, to endure across centuries, and to remind everyone who entered exactly how old and important the resident family happened to be. The rooms were vast and echoing. The ceiling sat impossibly far overhead. The furniture throughout tended to be the kind of piece you admire respectfully from a short distance rather than the kind you casually curl up on with a book. It amounted in practice to something closer to a very grand museum, one where the exhibits happened to include, among other things, her own bed. Then there was the household staff, seemingly everywhere at once, always quiet, always attentive, always technically present. A working palace runs on an entire small army of people, and every one of them carried a specific role, a specific daily routine, and a quiet, practiced awareness of essentially everything happening within those ancient walls. For Grace, this meant she was, in the most literal possible sense, almost never truly alone. Someone was reliably nearby at all times, ready to serve, to observe, to notice. It's the sort of arrangement that sounds purely luxurious right up, until you try to imagine having a genuinely private argument, a good private cry, or simply one lazy, unstructured morning without a rotating cast of professionals quietly present just outside the frame. Formal protocol governed the daily rhythm of palace life in ways that would exhaust almost anyone raised on more ordinary personal freedoms. Meals were structured formal occasions, complete with their own detailed rules. Daily schedules were planned well in advance and carefully managed by household staff. There were, in practice, established correct ways to handle nearly everything, methods that had been settled long before her arrival, and were not, generally speaking, inclined to bend simply to accommodate newly imported American habits. Even relaxation itself, the one part of daily life ordinarily supposed to remain unstructured, arrived with its own quiet set of expectations. Inside a working palace, there was, it turned out, even a correct way to relax, and someone on staff was generally keeping a quiet eye on it. Grace, characteristically, did not simply surrender passively to the museum-like atmosphere around her. She went to work on it, the same way she approached every difficult challenge in her life, with quiet, patient, stubborn determination. She carved out small personal pockets of genuine warmth, wherever she reasonably could, personalizing particular corners of the enormous residence, trying steadily to coax something at least resembling a real home out of all that formal historical splendor. If she couldn't fundamentally change the underlying nature of the place itself, she could, at minimum, plant small flags of ordinary human comfort here and there throughout it. A single room that felt like it genuinely belonged to her rather than to the dynasty at large. A private routine that felt entirely her own. But the underlying gap, by most accounts, never fully closed. She owned one of the most objectively beautiful private homes anywhere on Earth, and yet spent years quietly longing, in a thoroughly ordinary human way, for nothing grander than a single, genuinely private moment to herself. It stands as one of the quieter, more poignant ironies of her entire life story, that a woman who technically possessed an actual palace so often found herself wishing for something as modest as somewhere she could simply exhale, unobserved, even briefly. The grandeur surrounding her was entirely real. So, unfortunately, was the particular kind of loneliness that grandeur at this scale tends to quietly breed. Living inside the physical monument, though, turned out to be only half the challenge Grace faced in those early years. The other half, arguably the harder half, was learning to genuinely belong within it, to move through this ancient, tightly codified world as though she had somehow been born into it. And that required a kind of personal reinvention more total and more demanding than any single role she had ever taken on for a film. Perhaps the single hardest work of Grace's early years as princess was almost entirely invisible to outside observers. The sheer, sustained labor of quietly reinventing herself into someone the role genuinely demanded. She threw herself into learning French with real intensity, studying the customs and unwritten rules of her adopted court, methodically memorizing formal etiquette, family histories, and an overwhelming number of names, titles, and internal hierarchies. She had spent years as a working professional at the art of convincingly becoming other people on camera, and now she applied that exact same discipline to the single most demanding role of her actual life. But this particular role came with no ending, and no director anywhere who was ever going to call cut. Every gesture she made in public was scrutinized. Every small misstep was quietly noted, filed away, occasionally whispered about. Slowly, painstakingly, over months and then years, the American movie star learned to move through the highest circles of European royalty as though she had genuinely been born to it, an achievement of sustained willpower that looked, to the watching world, entirely effortless. Start with the language itself, because that alone represented a considerable mountain to climb. French was the language of her new court, her new adopted country, her husband's entire world, and she had arrived not remotely fluent in it. She needed to learn it properly and quickly, well enough to hold real conversations, to receive visiting dignitaries with appropriate warmth, to get through lengthy formal occasions without an embarrassing stumble. Anyone who has ever attempted to learn a new language as a full adult understands the particular, specific humiliation involved. The exact moment your naturally quick, confident personality suddenly finds itself trapped behind a vocabulary roughly the size of a young child's. Now try to imagine going through that exact process entirely in public, as a reigning princess, with an entire watching world quietly assuming you should already be flawless. Then came the formal etiquette, an entire, largely invisible rulebook governing precisely how European royalty was expected to move, speak, greet visitors, dine, and generally behave in nearly every conceivable social situation. There were specific correct forms of address for seemingly everyone. There were complex social hierarchies to memorize in full. There were long-established customs with roots reaching back centuries. Who bows first to whom, who is formally greeted before whom, which particular fork belongs with which specific course, which precise title requires which precise degree of formal warmth depending on the visitor's exact rank. It amounted to a system so elaborate and so deeply layered that people born directly into it still, on occasion, managed to get individual details wrong. And Grace, of course, had not been born into any of it. She had to learn the entire system essentially from scratch, as a full adult, under constant public scrutiny, with effectively no margin allowed for genuine error. And she brought to this enormous task the one significant advantage her previous career had actually given her. She was, by profession and by training, extraordinarily skilled at convincingly becoming other people. Acting is, at its core, the disciplined, technical study of how to be believably someone you fundamentally are not. And Grace had been very, very good at exactly that particular skill. She turned it now, quite deliberately, on her own actual life. She studied her demanding new role the same methodical way she had once studied film scripts, carefully absorbing the mannerisms, the protocols, the physical bearing, until she could perform Princess as flawlessly and convincingly as she had once performed any character written specifically for the screen. The cruel difference, of course, was that a film eventually ends. A role played on camera releases its performer the moment the director calls cut, and the actor goes home afterward and simply becomes themselves again, off the clock, unobserved. This particular role came with no cut, no wrap party, no going home afterward to simply be Grace again. She was, in a very real sense, permanently on, in a performance with no built-in intermission whatsoever. Every gesture she made in public was observed, and often quietly judged. Every small slip, a wrong word chosen, an improperly used title, a fleeting flash of the ordinary girl from Philadelphia showing briefly through, risked becoming a whispered story about the American who didn't quite fit the role. So over time, she simply stopped slipping, or at the very least, stopped letting it show in any visible way. Bit by careful bit, over months that stretched gradually into years, she became genuinely fluent in the language of being a princess, mastering not only the spoken language itself, but the customs, the physical bearing, the entire unspoken vocabulary of royal life, until she could glide convincingly through the most rarefied circles of European royalty, as though she had, in fact, always belonged there. The watching world saw only effortless natural grace in the finished result, which was, of course, precisely the entire intended point of all that invisible labor. Nobody watching from the outside was ever meant to see the actual work involved. But behind that seamless public performance sat a real, complicated marriage to a real, complicated man. And no amount of careful study of formal protocol could have adequately prepared her for the more personal task of actually navigating that particular relationship day to day. At the center of her new life stood Rainier himself, the husband whose entire world she had married directly into, and their relationship, by most credible accounts, was considerably more complex than the polished wedding footage had ever suggested. He was serious by nature, notably private, and thoroughly accustomed, by years of habit, to being obeyed without much argument. A man fundamentally shaped by decades of rule and inherited responsibility. Grace, by contrast, was warm, socially fluent, and accustomed to a rather different, more collaborative kind of personal freedom. The two of them clearly shared genuine affection and, over time, built something resembling a real working partnership. But they were also, undeniably, two strong-willed individuals attempting to build a single shared life together under the considerable added weight of an entire nation's expectations. There were real tensions along the way, ongoing adjustments, and the completely ordinary friction present in any real marriage, simply amplified enormously by the fact that theirs was never permitted to be genuinely private. Behind the carefully staged official portraits sat the far more relatable, far more human story of two people trying, with distinctly mixed and uneven success, to actually understand one another as individuals. Rainier had been ruling Monaco since he was a fairly young man, and reigning monarchs, understandably, tend to develop certain deeply ingrained habits over time. He was accustomed to being the final word on essentially any subject, the natural center of gravity in whatever room he happened to enter. This isn't meant as a harsh criticism so much as a simple occupational reality. Spend your entire formative adult life as the sole sovereign ruler of a state, and you generally do not grow into a person especially inclined to take suggestions gracefully from others. He was serious by temperament, notably guarded with his personal feelings, and protective, sometimes to the point of real control, over the wider world he governed, a world that now, of course, explicitly included his new wife. Grace, in many meaningful ways, represented something close to his opposite. She was warm and socially at ease with virtually anyone, shaped by years spent inside the collaborative, expressive, deeply social world of film production. She had spent her entire career surrounded by large, demanding personalities, and had learned early on exactly how to hold her own comfortably among them. She was also, underneath her famous poise, genuinely independent-minded, a woman who had openly defied her own family's wishes in order to build a career, and had then walked away from that same career entirely on her own personal terms at the height of its success. That is simply not the resume of someone naturally inclined to slot quietly and passively into a purely supporting role in someone else's life. So here were two genuinely strong-willed people, arriving from two very different formative worlds, attempting to build a single shared life together, with the significant added complication that their marriage itself was also, simultaneously, an official matter of state business. Their union was never merely personal. It was symbolic, explicitly dynastic in function, and permanently on public display, which meant that the completely ordinary give and take present in any healthy marriage had to unfold entirely inside a kind of fishbowl, with an entire watching nation, and a global public deeply invested in the fairy tale narrative, largely unwilling to tolerate even a single visible crack in the polished public image. There was real, lasting affection between them. That much comes through clearly in the historical record, in the partnership they steadily built together over the following decades, in the family they eventually raised, and in the many years they ultimately stayed together as a couple. But affection, as anyone in a long marriage can attest, is simply not the same thing as ease. Their marriage had its share of real tensions, its necessary adjustments, its extended stretches of genuine friction, exactly as any authentic long-term marriage naturally does. The meaningful difference in their specific case was that they were never really permitted to simply have an ordinary bad week privately, the way most couples can. Every visible strain in the relationship carried the added weight of enormous public expectation, the pervasive sense that the most famous couple in the entire world was somehow not permitted the completely normal frustrations that come with two people quietly sharing a life and a home. It stands, in the end, as one of the most genuinely relatable parts of her entire story, buried underneath all the crowns, titles, and camera flashes. Strip away the palace setting entirely, and what remains is something almost universally recognizable. Two people who loved each other in their own particular fashion, working hard and imperfectly to understand one another across a real and persistent gap in temperament and background, not always succeeding, but consistently trying. The fairy tale sold the public a flawless, effortless romance. The underlying reality was a genuine marriage, complicated, sometimes difficult, entirely human, between a naturally controlling prince and an independent-minded woman who had already given up an enormous amount simply to be standing there in the first place. And that marriage, along with the young family beginning to form around it, was about to be tested by forces well beyond the ordinary friction of two personalities, specifically by an extremely wealthy outsider who had his own ambitious plans for controlling the very country they now called home. Grace had, without fully realizing it at first, also married directly into a very specific and very real power struggle, one that had considerably less to do with romance and considerably more to do with control over Monaco's underlying economic engine. The Greek shipping magnate Aristotle Onassis had spent several years quietly and methodically buying up a controlling financial stake in the company that effectively operated Monte Carlo's casino, along with a significant share of the principality's broader business interests. And he had his own distinct, considered vision for the small state's future direction. This inevitably put him on a slow but very real collision course with Rainier, who had absolutely no intention of becoming a mere ceremonial figurehead inside his own sovereign country. Grace found herself now living directly inside a boardroom-style power struggle, dressed up convincingly as ordinary high society, one where invited dinner guests might simultaneously be her husband's direct business rivals, and where Monaco's surface-level glamour quietly masked a very real, ongoing fight over who would ultimately hold genuine control of the country. The underlying setup was almost absurd when examined plainly. There existed a large, powerful, long-established company that effectively controlled the casino, the grand hotels, and an enormous slice of everything that kept Monaco's economy actually functioning day to day. And one of the wealthiest individuals alive at the time had quietly purchased enough shares in that company to become, in practical effect, its majority owner, which meant that a private foreign individual, a shipping tycoon with a considerable personal taste for grandeur, now held enormous practical sway over the core economic engine of a sitting sovereign prince's own country. It was roughly as if someone had simply walked in and purchased a controlling interest in an entire kingdom, while its actual prince was busy elsewhere, occupied with the daily business of running it. Onassis had his own clear vision for Monaco's future, and it did not necessarily align neatly with Rainier's. The magnate generally favored keeping the principality highly exclusive, a discreet, glittering playground reserved primarily for the ultra-wealthy, the kind of rarefied enclave where old money instinctively felt comfortable and at home. Rainier, by contrast, understood clearly that a small country cannot realistically sustain itself indefinitely on a shrinking, aging pool of aristocrats and casino regulars alone. He wanted to actively modernize the principality, to broaden and expand its tourism base, to widen Monaco's overall appeal, and to secure its long-term future on considerably firmer economic ground than simply the changing whims of the very wealthy. Two determined men, two genuinely different visions, one extremely small country, and ultimately no realistic room for both visions to fully win out. The result was a slow, quietly simmering power struggle, conducted throughout with all the exquisite outward politeness typical of high society. This was, of course, not a war fought with armies or open conflict. It was fought instead at elegant dinner parties, in closed boardroom meetings, in the careful, patient maneuvering of company shares and personal influence. The very same people circulating comfortably through the same glittering social events were, underneath all the surface pleasantries, quietly locked in a real contest over who would ultimately control the actual destiny of the state. Grace lived directly in the middle of all this, hosting, attending, smiling warmly through it all, fully aware that some of her most elegant, charming dinner guests were, in practical terms, her own husband's determined adversaries. Rainier, to his considerable credit, absolutely refused to be reduced to a mere figurehead within his own realm, reasoning, correctly, that a prince who does not genuinely control his own country's affairs is a prince in name only, a purely decorative monarch simply presiding, powerlessly, over decisions made entirely by someone else. And he was not remotely willing to accept that particular fate quietly. So he set about methodically reclaiming full control, doing so with considerable patience and no small amount of political cunning, ultimately maneuvering to dilute the magnate's outsized ownership stake by having the state itself issue substantial new company shares, decisively shifting the underlying balance of power back toward the crown. Over the following months and years, the tycoon's previously dominant position was gradually broken, and effective control over Monaco's economic core returned firmly to where Rainier believed. From the start, it fundamentally belonged. For Grace personally, all of this amounted to an early and genuinely vivid education in the harder realities lying beneath the surface glamour of her adopted home. Her fairy tale kingdom, it turned out, was also very much a functioning business, and a fiercely contested one at that, where real power was genuinely at stake, where the stakes involved were significant, and where the beautiful, sun-drenched surface concealed a hard-nosed, high-stakes fight for actual control. The tiara, whatever its considerable beauty, was lovely to look at, but somebody, it turned out, still needed to actually own the casino underneath it. If there was one single duty that towered above every other expectation placed upon her, it was the production of an heir, and the pressure surrounding that specific obligation began almost immediately after the wedding itself. In early 1957, less than a full year into the marriage, Grace gave birth to a daughter, Caroline, amid enormous public celebration throughout Monaco. It was, by every account, a moment of genuine joy, and yet, in the cold arithmetic of dynastic succession, it was not quite the finish line everyone had been quietly waiting for. A daughter was cherished, celebrated, and deeply loved, but the established rules governing the Grimaldi line still leaned heavily, according to centuries of tradition, toward requiring a son. So even amid the very real happiness of new motherhood, a quiet clock kept steadily ticking in the background, and Grace understood, better than almost anyone around her, that her most closely watched responsibility as princess was not yet fully discharged. The sheer speed of it tells you a great deal about the underlying expectations at play. Less than a year after the wedding itself, the new princess was already delivering the next generation of the dynasty. There had been no leisurely settling-in period, no relaxed few years of simply being newlyweds before the subject of children arose. The dynasty needed continuity, and it needed that continuity promptly, which meant that Grace's own body had become, in a very real and uncomfortable sense, a matter of active national interest. It is a genuinely strange thing to sit with, the idea that the arrival of your very first child is being anxiously awaited not merely by your immediate family, but by an entire watching country. When Caroline was born, the surrounding celebration was entirely genuine and considerable in scale. A new child had arrived within the palace. The royal family had grown. The fairy tale in the public imagination had produced its first natural sequel. Monaco rejoiced openly. The wider world took notice and celebrated along with it, and Grace herself experienced the real, overwhelming joy of becoming a mother for the very first time. On every purely human level, it was an unqualified triumph and a genuine blessing. A healthy daughter born to a young couple that the entire watching world had, by this point, thoroughly invested itself in rooting for. But dynasties, as we've already seen, do not ultimately run according to purely human emotional logic. They run according to established rules, and the specific rules of succession within this particular ancient royal house leaned decisively toward male heirs. A daughter was adored without reservation, treasured completely, celebrated warmly and sincerely. And yet, within the cold, unforgiving logic of dynastic succession, she did not fully resolve the underlying question that had hovered quietly over the entire marriage from its very beginning. The succession itself remained technically unsecured. The country still needed, by long-standing tradition and by treaty, a son in order to feel genuinely secure about its long-term future, and everyone within the palace understood this reality perfectly well, which meant that even amid the sincere delight surrounding a healthy new baby, the underlying pressure never actually lifted. It simply, briefly, paused. Try to imagine the peculiar cruelty embedded in that situation. You have just given birth to your first child. You are flooded, quite naturally, with love, exhaustion, and overwhelming joy. And hovering just at the edge of that private celebration sits the unspoken, ever-present awareness that the larger job is not yet considered finished. The clock, briefly quiet during the celebration itself, soon begins ticking again. More is expected, and everyone around you knows it. The single most private and profound experience of an entire lifetime is also, simultaneously, functioning as only a partial fulfillment of a very public, very consequential obligation, genuinely applauded, and yet not quite, by the standards being silently applied, considered fully complete. Grace, sharp and clear-eyed as she had always been, understood this dynamic perfectly. She knew with total clarity that her most closely scrutinized work as princess was never really going to be diplomacy, or charitable patronage, or fashion influence. It was fundamentally this single specific task. The continued survival of a 700-year dynastic line rested directly on what happened next within the palace nursery, and a daughter, however genuinely beloved, had not yet fully closed that particular case. She had accomplished something wonderful and something genuinely significant, and it still was not, by the brutal external standard of dynastic necessity, quite considered sufficient. So she carried the very real joy of Caroline's arrival alongside the simultaneous knowledge that the country was still watching, still hopping, still quietly counting on her to deliver the one specific outcome that would finally, fully settle the matter of Monaco's future. She would cross that particular finish line the following year, and when she finally did, The entire principality would hear about it through the unmistakable sound of cannon fire echoing across the harbor. In 1958, Grace gave birth to a son, Albert, and his arrival brought with it a distinctly different, almost physically palpable kind of relief that rippled outward through the entire principality. The succession, at long last, was fully secured. The dynasty now had its clear future. Ceremonial cannons were fired in celebration across the harbor, and the country, in a very real collective sense, seemed to finally exhale. For Grace personally, the moment represented both a deeply personal joy and the complete fulfillment of the single most important formal expectation ever placed upon her. In roughly 2 years' time, she had married directly into an ancient royal house, learned an entirely new language along with its complex customs, and successfully provided both a cherished daughter and the crucial male heir the dynasty required. By almost any external measure imaginable, she had triumphantly accomplished absolutely everything that had ever been asked of her. The stranger, more genuinely human part of the story was discovering, in the months that followed, that having successfully met every single external expectation placed upon her did not automatically translate into personal happiness. The cannon fire itself was not simply a symbolic flourish. Monaco genuinely marked the birth of a male heir with a full, thunderous artillery salute, a public announcement fired directly across the harbor, audible to essentially the entire principality, formally declaring that the dynasty's future was now considered secure. A daughter, the year before, had been celebrated warmly and sincerely. A son was celebrated, quite literally, with gunpowder. The considerable difference in scale and volume tells you, with real precision, exactly how the older established rules weighed these two very different events. And Grace, resting in the palace with her newborn son beside her, would have heard exactly what that particular thunder actually meant. For the wider country, the birth represented pure, unambiguous relief. The anxious underlying question that had hovered quietly over the entire marriage from its earliest negotiations, the one directly tied to formal treaties, to national sovereignty, and to the continued independent survival of Monaco as a sovereign state, had finally, decisively been answered. There was now a son. The dynastic line would continue uninterrupted. The genuine nightmare scenario of a dynasty simply ending, and a small country consequently losing its cherished special status, had been fully averted. The entire principality, in a real sense, could finally breathe out. In just 2 remarkably short years, Grace had personally delivered not only 2 children, but the underlying security of an entire nation. And on a purely personal level, it was genuinely a source of real joy for her as well. This was, after all, her own son, her second child, a healthy baby boy born into a rapidly growing family she already loved deeply. The personal happiness involved was entirely real, layered directly on top of the wider public sense of triumph. She had, quite simply, done it. She had accomplished, with genuinely remarkable speed and characteristic grace, the single most important task ever formally assigned to her. The one that everything else in her new life had, in a sense, been quietly building toward. Step back for a moment and survey everything she had actually accomplished in barely 2 years, and the sheer scale of it becomes genuinely staggering. She had married directly into one of Europe's oldest and most storied royal houses. She had learned an entirely new language from scratch, and had mastered a dizzyingly complex, centuries-old code of formal court etiquette. She had successfully transformed herself, through sheer sustained effort, from Hollywood actress into a convincingly flawless princess. And she had produced both a genuinely cherished daughter and the all-important male heir who had now fully secured the throne's future. By every available external measure, she stood as an unqualified, spectacular success. If being a princess had come with formal annual performance reviews, hers would have read, by any reasonable standard, as essentially perfect, which is precisely where the deeper, more complicated human truth of her situation begins. Because meeting every single external expectation, checking off every required box, triumphing completely at every formally assigned task, did not, it turned out, automatically deliver the lasting contentment the fairy tale had originally promised. She had done, by any objective measure, absolutely everything correctly, and discovered in the process the quiet, genuinely disorienting fact that doing everything correctly is simply not the same thing as actually being happy. The applause eventually faded. The ceremonial canons fell silent, and underneath the outwardly successful, universally admired princess, there remained, quietly, still a real woman, far from her original home, living out a genuinely gilded life she had chosen for herself, but one she did not, in every private moment, necessarily love. That persistent gap between the flawless outward performance and the more complicated private feeling underneath it is, in many ways, where the real, actual Grace continued to live throughout these years. She had successfully secured the throne, delighted an entire nation, and fully satisfied what many considered her essential destiny. And she was about to learn, in the years immediately ahead, that the very fairy tale kingdom she had sacrificed so much to serve could very nearly vanish entirely, taking all of that hard-won personal security along with it. In 1962, the storybook kingdom Grace had married into came remarkably close to simply ceasing to exist, and the threat this time did not come from within the palace walls, but from an enormous neighboring power just across the border. France, under President Charles de Gaulle, had grown deeply frustrated with Monaco's long-standing status as a convenient tax haven, a place where French citizens and French companies could quietly shelter significant fortunes from French taxation. De Gaulle applied genuinely fierce diplomatic pressure, at one point even threatening an actual physical blockade of the tiny state. Suddenly, the small, glittering principality Grace had married into found itself locked in a genuine high-stakes standoff with one of the major powers of post-war Europe. It was a tense, at times genuinely frightening chapter of her life, one that stripped away the surrounding glamour almost entirely and revealed the small, vulnerable country actually sitting underneath it. For Grace personally, it served as a stark, sobering reminder that her fairy tale realm was, in the end, a real and genuinely fragile place, one whose continued survival could never simply be taken for granted. The underlying root of the entire dispute was money, as these particular disputes so often tend to be. Monaco had, for years, offered an extremely attractive proposition to wealthy individuals and companies: relocate here, and pay little or nothing in taxes you would otherwise owe elsewhere. This arrangement was, naturally, wonderful for Monaco and for its already glamorous international reputation. It was considerably less wonderful for France, which watched, with mounting frustration, as its own wealthiest citizens and businesses quietly moved significant fortunes across the nearby border, specifically to avoid French tax authorities. For a large, proud nation like France, having a tiny neighboring principality effectively function as a convenient escape hatch for its wealthiest taxpayers was, understandably, a source of real and growing irritation. And France, during this particular era, happened to be led by Charles de Gaulle, a towering, formidable historical figure not especially known for either patience or for backing down once he had committed to a position. He decided, at a certain point, that the existing arrangement had gone on for quite long enough, and he brought the full considerable weight of French governmental pressure to bear directly on Monaco. This was not, by any stretch, a polite diplomatic disagreement conducted quietly through normal channels. France went so far as to explicitly threaten genuinely drastic measures, including the real possibility of effectively sealing off the tiny principality entirely. A genuine blockade of a small state that happened to be almost completely surrounded, on every landward side, by French territory. Monaco, remember, is little more than a narrow sliver of Mediterranean coastline, hemmed in tightly on all sides by its considerably larger neighbor. A sufficiently determined France could, in theory, squeeze the tiny principality much the way a closing hand might squeeze a small marble. The underlying power imbalance involved was almost comic in its sheer extremity, viewed from a certain distance. On one side stood France, a major world power with a vast standing military, a substantial national economy, and a population numbering in the tens of millions. On the other side stood Monaco, a country small enough to comfortably stroll across before lunch, possessing little more than a prince, a famous casino, and a considerable amount of accumulated international charm. It amounted, in practical terms, to something close to the geopolitical equivalent of a reigning heavyweight boxing champion, menacing a particularly well-dressed toddler standing nearby. And yet, despite the seemingly absurd mismatch, the toddler's entire continued independent existence as a sovereign nation was, quite genuinely, on the line. For a genuinely tense period, the underlying threat felt entirely real and entirely frightening. This was not, by any means, the familiar glamorous Monaco of yacht-filled harbors and glittering gala evenings that the world had come to know through the wedding coverage. This was, instead, Monaco fully exposed, small, visibly vulnerable, staring down a considerably larger neighbor that possessed the genuine practical power to strangle its economy almost entirely if it chose to follow through. The fairy tale glitter fell away completely during this period, revealing the harder underlying truth that genuine sovereignty for a state this small is, in practice, a delicate, carefully negotiated arrangement, entirely dependent on the ongoing goodwill of considerably larger neighboring powers, and that particular goodwill had, for the moment, largely evaporated. For Grace, watching her adopted husband's country teeter genuinely close to the edge of being effectively absorbed, the experience amounted to a deeply sobering education. She had married into what had appeared, from the outside, to be an eternal fairy tale kingdom, and had instead discovered that it was, in practical reality, a genuinely fragile small state whose continued survival could be seriously threatened by little more than a single stroke of a far more powerful neighbor's pen. The palace, the crown, the ancient 7th century dynasty, all of it, it turned out, rested on considerably less solid ground than the surrounding fairy tale had ever suggested. Nothing, she was learning, could safely be taken entirely for granted here. Eventually, as these particular high-stakes confrontations generally tend to resolve, the crisis was settled through careful negotiation and mutual compromise rather than actual catastrophe. New arrangements were reached between the two governments. Necessary adjustments were made on both sides. Monaco ultimately survived the crisis with its formal independence fully intact, if noticeably somewhat chastened by the experience. The immediate crisis passed, but it left a lasting mark on Grace's understanding of her own adopted home, and, as if to underscore just how many directions genuine pressure could arrive from during this period of her life, that very same year would go on to offer her an entirely different, and in some ways far more personally tempting, challenge, one arriving directly from her own abandoned former life. That same general period brought Grace what was arguably the single most tempting professional offer of her entire time as a reigning princess, a genuine, serious chance to act again. Alfred Hitchcock, the celebrated director who had adored working with her and had helped make her a genuine star in the first place, wanted her to take the lead role in an upcoming new film called Marnie. For one brief, genuinely thrilling moment, it actually seemed possible that she might return. Grace herself was clearly interested. Rainier, somewhat surprisingly, was initially open to the general idea. Concrete plans were sketched out, and then, gradually, the public reaction arrived. The people of Monaco, it turned out, strongly disliked the entire idea of their reigning princess returning to the screen, and the resulting social pressure steadily mounted until the entire plan quietly collapsed under its own weight. She ultimately turned the role down. It amounted in the end to a fairly small door quietly swinging shut, but it was a door that, in closing, sealed off something genuinely enormous, the last real, concrete possibility that she might ever again become, even briefly, Grace Kelly, the working actress. After the Marnie episode, that particular chapter of her life was truly, permanently over. To fully appreciate exactly how tempting this specific offer must have been, it helps to remember precisely who was making it. Hitchcock was not simply some ordinary working director extending a routine offer. He was the specific filmmaker who had drawn out some of the finest, most memorable work of her entire career, who understood her particular strengths and screen presence better than perhaps anyone else in the industry, and who had personally helped make her a genuine legend during their earlier collaborations. Their working partnership had been, by any reasonable measure, one of the truly great creative pairings of that entire era of filmmaking. So when he came calling once again with a compelling new project, specifically wanting her positioned at its center, this was clearly not some random, easily dismissed offer. This was, quite specifically, the one person from her entire former life most genuinely capable of tempting her back into it. Grace was interested, and understandably so. This was, after all, the exact work she had always genuinely loved, now being offered once more by the one director who fully understood how to use her particular talents to their fullest. Rainier, somewhat remarkably given his generally protective instincts, was initially receptive to the general idea. Concrete plans began quietly taking shape. There was real discussion of exactly how such an arrangement might practically work, how a reigning princess might conceivably slip back onto an active film set without the entire surrounding situation collapsing under the weight of public scandal. For a brief, genuinely hopeful window, the seemingly impossible appeared almost within reach. A princess who might also, somehow, simultaneously remain a working actress. Then, gradually, harsh practical reality reasserted itself, arriving specifically in the form of sustained public opinion within Monaco itself. The people of the principality, it turned out, did not care for this particular idea at all. The very notion of their own princess, their carefully cultivated symbol of dignity, their living fairy tale figure, returning to the world of film, of make-believe, of professionally pretending to be other people for money, struck a great many of them as fundamentally unbecoming, even genuinely undignified. This, in their view, was their princess, and reigning princesses simply did not moonlight as working movie stars on the side. The public disapproval steadily grew. The surrounding social pressure continued mounting, and what had briefly seemed genuinely possible began, gradually, to curdle into something clearly untenable. Faced directly with the evident displeasure of the very country she had already given up an entire flourishing career to serve in the first place, Grace ultimately made the specific choice she had, by this point in her life, consistently made whenever the two considerations came into direct conflict. She turned the role down. Duty, once again, won out, exactly as duty had been consistently winning since the very day she first said yes to marrying the prince. The film ultimately proceeded without her, with a different actress eventually stepping into the role, and Grace remained fully in her palace, a princess, and specifically not an actress, exactly as her formal role continued to demand. It might sound, on its surface, like a relatively small matter, one declined film role among the countless others she could theoretically have made in some entirely different life. But it was not, in any meaningful sense, actually small. It represented the last genuinely real chance. This particular moment marked the point at which the door to her former identity, which had, in some quiet sense, been standing slightly ajar throughout all these intervening years, finally swung fully shut and firmly latched. Before Marnie, there had always existed at least the faint theoretical possibility that she might someday, somehow, return to acting in some capacity. After Marnie, that particular possibility simply no longer existed. That specific part of her, the trained artist, the accomplished performer, the woman who had once genuinely won an Academy Award, was now permanently retired, not entirely by her own free personal choice, but by the accumulated weight of a formal role that ultimately could not tolerate any real professional competition for her time and public attention. She let the opportunity go with her usual outward grace, exactly as she let go of nearly everything else in her carefully managed public life. But somewhere behind that consistent public poise, a door had genuinely closed, and she clearly knew it. And on the other side of that now permanently closed door waited something the original fairy tale had never once bothered to advertise to its audience: a persistent, quietly gnawing loneliness. Beneath the carefully maintained public poise, Grace often privately ached for home in ways she rarely allowed the wider public to see or even suspect. She missed the United States. She missed her own extended family back in Philadelphia. She missed the easy, unstructured freedoms of the earlier life she had voluntarily traded away for the crown. The palace, for all its considerable outward beauty, could feel, from the inside, like an extremely elegant form of confinement, its walls quietly lined throughout with layers of accumulated duty. She was, in a very real sense, constantly surrounded by other people, and yet frequently genuinely lonely, admired openly by essentially everyone around her, yet truly, personally known by almost no one at all. The particular phrase that would eventually attach itself permanently to her story, the gilded cage, proved cruel primarily because of how consistently accurate it actually was. She had, by any external measure, everything a proper fairy tale traditionally promises, and discovered, as many people placed in similar situations eventually do, that a life arranged entirely around external appearances leaves remarkably little genuine room for the actual person quietly living inside it. She adapted, as she consistently always did with every major challenge life presented her. But adapting successfully to a difficult situation is simply not the same thing as genuinely belonging within it. The underlying homesickness was real, and it proved remarkably persistent over the years. She was, at her core, an American woman raised in a large American city, shaped fundamentally by American social rhythms and American everyday ease, and she now lived permanently across an ocean, inside a small European principality where essentially everything around her felt foreign, formal, and steeped in centuries of established tradition. She missed her own family, the specific people who had known her personally long before the crown ever entered the picture, who could still see the actual grace underneath the princess. She missed the completely ordinary, casual freedoms of her earlier life, the simple ability to move through the everyday world without every single step becoming, in some sense, a formal public occasion. The distance involved was never merely geographic. It represented, more fundamentally, a genuine gap between who she had previously been and who she was now formally required to be. And that particular gap, notably, did not meaningfully close with the simple passage of time. The palace itself, so consistently beautiful in every published photograph, could feel, from the genuine inside experience, remarkably like a beautifully appointed prison. This is precisely the underlying paradox that gave the gilded cage description its lasting descriptive power. Every conceivable luxury surrounded her at all times, and yet her actual daily life remained hemmed in on essentially every side by duty, by formal protocol, and by the relentless ongoing requirement to consistently perform her assigned public role. She could not simply go wherever she personally wished, could not act purely as she pleased, could not freely be whoever she happened to feel like being on any particular given day. Ordinary freedom, in the everyday sense most people take entirely for granted, had been the genuine price of the crown, and she had paid that particular price in full, likely without fully appreciating, at the actual time she agreed to the marriage, quite how much it would ultimately end up costing her personally. The loneliness, when it came down to it, was consistently the sharpest part of the entire arrangement. She was never physically alone, of course, not for any meaningful stretch of time. She remained constantly surrounded by household staff, by court officials, by visiting dignitaries, by the endless steady parade of people that any active royal life inevitably brings with it. And she was, without question, widely admired, even genuinely adored by millions of people around the world who felt, through countless photographs and newsreels, that they knew her intimately. But being consistently surrounded by other people is simply not the same thing as being genuinely accompanied by them. And being widely admired from a distance is simply not the same thing as being truly, personally known. The people around her related primarily to the princess, to the carefully constructed symbol, to the formal role itself, while the actual woman living inside that role, with her own specific longings, her particular dry sense of humor, her private sadness, remained known to only a genuinely small handful of people. It is entirely possible, it turns out, to be among the most famous individuals alive anywhere in the world and still feel that almost nobody around you truly sees the actual person underneath. She adapted to all of this because adapting successfully was, fundamentally, simply what Grace consistently did whenever faced with a difficult new challenge. She had successfully adapted to Hollywood's demanding studio system earlier in her career. She had adapted to an entirely new language and an unfamiliar foreign royal court. And now, gradually, she adapted to this particular challenge as well, methodically building a functional, outwardly dignified, seemingly contented life for herself within these very real constraints. From the outside looking in, she managed the entire situation beautifully. The general public consistently saw a woman who appeared to have everything, and who seemed genuinely serene in the possession of it all. But successfully adapting to life inside a cage is simply not the same thing as being truly free within it, and building a functional life inside real constraints is simply not the same thing as genuinely belonging there. She had, in effect, traded the full richness of her earlier, more complete self in exchange for the fairy tale, and the fairy tale itself, it gradually became clear, had remarkably little genuine room reserved for a whole, complete human being. The gilded cage, as it turned out, carried one further cruelty built directly into its basic design. Grace could never even fully feel its bars in genuine privacy, because the cameras, in any meaningful sense, never actually stopped watching her. She had, in effect, traded one distinct kind of fame for an entirely different kind, and this second kind never once offered her a real day off. As a working actress, she had at least been able to step out of the spotlight temporarily between individual film projects. As a reigning princess, the metaphorical film simply never wrapped production. The international press pursued her relentlessly, carefully cataloging her clothing choices, her body weight, her facial expressions, her growing children, and virtually every public appearance she made. Every single outing became, in effect, a small performance. Every photograph taken represented a potential future headline. She managed her public image with all the considerable skill of the trained professional she had once genuinely been. But the sheer permanence of this particular scrutiny was something entirely new, and it proved genuinely exhausting over time. There was no character anymore to hide behind, no separate role to retreat into when things grew difficult. The role, at this point, simply was her, full-time, and the wider world had effectively appointed itself her permanent, unblinking audience. Consider carefully the underlying difference between these two distinct kinds of fame. As a working actress, however genuinely famous she became, she had worked on individual projects that each carried a clear beginning and a clear ending. A film would finish shooting, then eventually get released, and in the gaps between individual projects there existed real breathing room, genuine time away from the cameras, extended stretches during which she could simply live her life normally. The spotlight, however intense while it lasted, arrived with built-in intermissions. You could step fully out of it, recover privately, and then deliberately step back into it whenever the next project genuinely called for it. Fame, for all its considerable pressures, came with natural pauses. Royal fame, by sharp contrast, offered no intermissions whatsoever. There was no rap date anywhere on the horizon, no scheduled hiatus, no eventual season finale after which everyone involved simply went quietly home. She was, in the most literal sense, the reigning Princess of Monaco every single hour of every single day for the entire remainder of her life, and the wider world's active interest in her never meaningfully let up, even slightly, across all those years. The press pursued her with an appetite that never genuinely dulled with time, and virtually everything about her remained fair game for coverage. Her clothing choices were closely analyzed. Her weight was monitored and frequently remarked upon in print. Her facial expressions in photographs were carefully interpreted by outside observers. Her growing children were regularly photographed, often without her direct consent. Her every public appearance, however minor, became usable material dissected, reported on, and openly judged by strangers. This meant in practice that every single outing, no matter how genuinely minor or routine, functioned as a kind of performance. Simply leaving the palace grounds was never just leaving the palace. It meant, functionally, stepping onto a public stage where cameras were reliably waiting, and where any captured image might well become tomorrow's published headline. A visibly tired expression, an unflattering camera angle, a brief moment of entirely ordinary human imperfection. Any of it could potentially be frozen in a photograph and broadcast widely, then picked apart at length by commentators who had never actually met her. So she remained, essentially without exception, consistently composed, consistently aware of her surroundings, consistently managing the public impression she made, because that particular impression had, in every practical sense, become genuinely public property rather than something purely personal. She was, at least, uniquely well equipped for this specific challenge. She had spent years as a trained professional at exactly this particular skill, the disciplined, technical management of public image, the careful art of appearing precisely as she wished to be perceived by an audience. Her earlier Hollywood training had made her a genuine master of working with cameras, and she brought the full weight of that training directly to bear on her ongoing royal life. Very few people alive at the time could plausibly have handled this level of relentless, sustained scrutiny with more genuine polish than she managed. But polish, however impressive, is simply not the same thing as ease, and even a genuine master of the craft occasionally grows tired. The truly grinding part of the whole arrangement was never really the underlying difficulty of the performance itself. It was, instead, the sheer permanence of it, day after day, year after year. As an actress, whenever genuine exhaustion set in, she had always been able to retreat temporarily into a fictional character, hide briefly inside an assigned role, allow someone entirely invented to carry the emotional weight for a while. As a reigning princess, there existed no equivalent fictional character to retreat into. The role itself was not, in any real sense, a separate part she was merely playing. It was, quite simply, her own actual name, her own actual face, her own genuine self on continuous public display without any real pause or meaningful shelter available. The wider world had, in effect, cast her in the longest-running production imaginable, with herself functioning as the only possible available star, and there would never be any final closing performance to look forward to. She remained, essentially always visibly on camera, always the princess, always being watched by someone, and the underlying scrutiny, notably, was about to grow only more intense over time, because being genuinely beloved by an entire watching public, it turned out, was not some restful state of grace. It functioned, in practice, as a demanding full-time job with a remarkably packed ongoing schedule. Being a reigning princess, it turned out in practice, was considerably less a life of relaxed leisure than an unrelenting calendar of formal obligations, and Grace consistently filled hers with genuine, substantive purpose rather than simply going through the motions. She took on the formal presidency of the Monaco Red Cross, threw herself with real commitment into sustained charitable work, and gradually became the gracious central figure at the principality's seemingly endless round of galas, formal ceremonies, and official receptions. Chief among these recurring events was the celebrated Rose Ball, a genuinely dazzling annual social occasion that she personally helped establish as a fixture of Monaco's social calendar. To outside observers watching from a distance, All of it looked like effortless, uncomplicated glamour, simply one beautiful evening following seamlessly after another. In actual reality, it represented sustained, demanding work, the steady, unglamorous daily business of being consistently beloved, essentially on a fixed schedule. Grace clearly understood that her personal warmth had, in a real sense, become a genuine national asset for Monaco, and she spent that particular asset generously and consistently, whether or not she happened to genuinely feel like smiling on any given evening. There exists a persistent popular fantasy suggesting that royal life is fundamentally a life of relaxed leisure, of simply lounging comfortably in palaces while being handed grapes by attentive servants. The actual reality, at least for any genuinely conscientious reigning princess, proved considerably closer to running a permanent, ongoing public relations campaign, complete with an itinerary that essentially never emptied out. Grace's individual days filled up steadily with formal duties, scheduled appearances, and accumulated responsibilities. A steady, continuous stream of obligations that arrived directly alongside the title itself, regardless of whether she happened to personally feel like fulfilling them on any particular morning. The crown, in this sense, was never really a reward simply to be passively collected and enjoyed. It functioned, in daily practice, as an actual demanding job she effectively clocked into fresh every single morning. Her charitable work throughout this period was genuinely real and substantial, not merely ceremonial window dressing. She took on active leadership of the Monaco Red Cross, contributing far more than simply the use of her famous name, and immersed herself directly in the specific causes any reigning princess in her position was generally expected to actively champion. This was not simply ceremonial hand-waving performed for cameras. It meant sitting through real planning meetings, making numerous public appearances, and doing the genuine, often unglamorous labor involved in actually steering a large charitable organization and meaningfully raising its public profile. She possessed a platform of truly extraordinary visibility, and she consistently made active use of it, effectively converting the world's ongoing fascination with her personal story into meaningful attention and real financial support for causes that genuinely needed both. Then there was the packed social calendar itself, that glittering, genuinely exhausting parade of galas, formal ceremonies, and official receptions that together formed the connective social tissue of Monaco's broader public life. As reigning princess, she functioned as the gracious central figure at essentially all of it. The attentive hostess, the honored guest, the radiant presence whose mere attendance made each individual event feel like a genuine occasion worth remembering. The undisputed crown jewel of this recurring social season was the celebrated Rose Ball, a spectacular annual gathering that she personally helped elevate into one of the genuine fixtures of Monaco's yearly social calendar. An evening built around flowers, elegance, and international glamour that gradually became permanently inseparable from her broader public image. To virtually everyone watching from the outside, all of this looked like the easiest imaginable work in the world. A beautiful woman, wearing beautiful gowns, attending one beautiful evening event after another, seemingly without end, an unbroken stream of champagne and chandeliers stretching endlessly forward. Who, watching casually from a distance, could reasonably call any of that genuine work? But that particular illusion is precisely what made her so consistently skilled at the underlying job itself. Being reliably, flawlessly gracious across an essentially endless schedule of formal public events is, in fact, genuinely demanding, the specific sort of sustained effort that looks entirely effortless only because a true professional is deliberately working hard to make it appear that way. Behind every outwardly serene public appearance sat real advanced preparation, considerable underlying stamina, and the sustained discipline required to reliably perform genuine warmth essentially on command, because that particular skill was, underneath everything else, the actual core assignment. Grace understood, with her usual clear-eyed precision, that her personal charm and natural warmth were no longer simply private personal traits belonging only to her. They had become, in a very real practical sense, genuine national assets that the entire principality had come to depend upon economically. Her consistent graciousness actively drew the wider world's affection and attention toward Monaco, and that particular affection carried genuine, measurable economic value. So she spent it generously and deliberately, evening after evening, effectively being beloved on a fixed public schedule, radiating warmth at gala after gala regardless of whether her feet genuinely ached, regardless of whether she happened to be feeling homesick that particular evening, regardless of whether she personally felt like attending at all. It amounted, in practice, to the ongoing business of being adored, and she ran that particular business remarkably well throughout these years. But even the most consistently beautiful, universally admired princess still needed somewhere private to put the specific parts of herself that all those glittering galas had genuinely no use for. And Grace found that particular outlet, in large part, within the wider world of art and artistic patronage. Denied any realistic path back to the stage or screen, Grace instead poured her considerable remaining creative hunger into becoming a genuine, committed champion of the arts more broadly. And it was here, in this particular pursuit, that she found something reasonably close to genuine personal fulfillment. She actively supported dance, theater, and Monaco's broader artistic life with real, sustained devotion, generously lending her name, her personal time, and her considerable practical influence toward nurturing the working careers of other artists. If she could no longer personally perform herself, she reasoned, she could at least help ensure that genuinely beautiful things continued being made and properly seen by audiences. This sustained artistic patronage became one of the most genuinely meaningful threads running through her later years as princess, and it would ultimately outlast her, continuing on through the various foundations and formal programs later built around her name and memory. It served, in a quiet but real way, as her own personal means of keeping at least one foot planted firmly in the artistic world she had loved deeply and had been effectively forced to leave behind. The underlying creative hunger clearly did not simply disappear once her acting career formally ended. Grace was, by fundamental temperament, a genuine artist, a person naturally drawn toward performance, toward beauty, toward creative expression in its various forms. And giving up acting professionally did not remove that particular part of her personality. It simply left it for a time, without any clear outlet to channel itself through. You cannot spend your formative early adult years as a celebrated working performer and then reasonably expect that underlying creative impulse to simply, politely evaporate on your wedding day. It remains present, restless, actively searching for somewhere new to go. She eventually found its destination in sustained artistic patronage. If she could no longer personally stand in the spotlight herself, she reasoned, she could instead become the person who actively made that same spotlight possible for other talented artists. She threw herself with real commitment into supporting the arts, with particular focus on dance and theater, actively championing individual performers and entire arts companies, along with Monaco's broader cultural life more generally. She brought to these various causes the three specific resources she had accumulated in genuine abundance: her name, which could reliably open essentially any door anywhere in the world; her personal time, which she gave generously and consistently; and her considerable influence, which could realistically transform a struggling artistic venture into a genuinely celebrated one almost overnight. This represented considerably more than a simple hobby or a purely ceremonial obligation performed for appearances. It stood, by many credible accounts, as one of the genuinely fulfilling elements of her later years as reigning princess, a specific space where her old creative fire could continue burning, simply redirected toward a new purpose. There exists a particular, genuine satisfaction in actively nurturing someone else's raw talent, in personally being the specific reason a promising dancer gets an important opportunity to dance, or a new play successfully gets staged for an audience. And Grace appears, by all reasonable accounts, to have found real, lasting meaning in exactly that kind of work. It allowed her to remain genuinely connected to the world she had always loved most deeply, the world of working artists, of live performances, of deliberately created beauty, even though she could no longer personally serve as an active creator within that world herself. In a very real sense, it functioned as the closest available substitute for actually going home again. The film industry had in many ways been her true original country, the specific place where she had felt most completely and authentically herself, and her marriage had, in a sense, permanently exiled her from it. Artistic patronage became her particular way of visiting that country regularly, surrounding herself deliberately with working artists, actively supporting their creative output, immersing herself directly in the ongoing life of theater and dance. She could not personally perform any longer, but she could genuinely belong, at least at the edges, to the same broader creative world that had originally shaped her as a person. And this particular devotion left a genuinely lasting mark on the world. The various foundations and formal programs eventually built around her name, specifically dedicated to supporting emerging artists early in their careers, would go on to carry this particular passion forward for decades after her own death. What had originally begun as one woman's personal, redirected creative hunger gradually became, over time, a genuine lasting institution, a durable legacy of artistic patronage that ultimately outlived her by many decades. So the wider world of art became, in a real sense, her chosen refuge, her ongoing contribution, and her quiet, sustained act of remaining recognizably herself within an otherwise highly constrained life. But there were also even smaller, considerably more private refuges she carefully kept entirely for herself alone, specific hobbies the international tabloid press never really bothered to photograph or report on. And it was precisely there, tucked away in those genuinely unwatched personal corners of her life, that the real, unguarded Grace could finally, briefly exhale. In the carefully guarded private corners of her life, Grace cultivated a handful of personal passions that belonged entirely to her, small, quiet rebellions against a world that had scheduled essentially everything else about her existence. She became genuinely devoted to the delicate art of pressing flowers, carefully creating intricate botanical collages from dried petals and leaves, and she found real, sustained joy in poetry, in gardens, and in the natural world more broadly. These were emphatically not the sorts of pursuits the international tabloid press had any particular interest in covering, which was, in a very real sense, precisely their genuine appeal to her. They were hers alone, unwatched, unjudged by outside observers, a way of quietly making something with her own two hands that no palace committee anywhere ever needed to formally approve. In a life almost entirely defined by public expectation and constant scrutiny, these quiet, modest hobbies represented the one space where the actual Grace, curious, genuinely creative, and just a bit unconventional in her private tastes, was reliably allowed to simply exist without an audience. Every proper fairy tale princess, it seems, genuinely needs one room the wider story simply cannot reach. These particular hobbies were hers. Of all these various private hobbies, the devotion to pressed flowers is perhaps the single most telling detail, and certainly the most quietly charming. She developed a genuine, sustained devotion to the craft itself, carefully gathering blossoms and individual leaves from the palace gardens, pressing them with patient care, and then arranging the delicate, preserved fragments into intricate finished collages, small works of art assembled entirely from carefully preserved fragments of the natural world. It was slow, meticulous, genuinely patient work, the specific sort of activity that demands real stillness and sustained attention, and that ultimately produces nothing grander than a single beautiful arrangement of carefully dried petals. And that, in a real sense, was precisely the point of the activity. In a life crowded almost constantly with grand public occasions, Here was something deliberately modest, genuinely tactile, and entirely privately her own. She loved poetry as well, and gardens, and the natural world more generally. The slow, unglamorous, entirely unposed reality of simply growing, living things. These particular interests belonged to a person genuinely seeking texture and quiet in her life, a deliberate counterweight to the relentlessly polished formality that governed essentially everything else around her. There is something genuinely poignant in picturing one of the most photographed women alive anywhere in the world, spending her private hours quietly bent over pressed petals, or entirely lost inside a book of verse, seeking, in these small private pleasures, the ordinary human satisfaction her genuinely extraordinary public life so rarely allowed her to experience. What made these particular hobbies so genuinely precious to her was precisely what made them, at the same time, completely invisible to outsiders. The tabloid press had no real interest whatsoever in pressed flowers. There was, quite simply, no usable headline hiding inside a private botanical collage, no scandal lurking inside a genuine love of poetry. The international press hungered consistently for glamour, drama, and public spectacle, and these gentle private pursuits offered essentially none of that, which is exactly why they belonged entirely to her, and to no one else. In a life where nearly everything else had effectively become public property, here at last existed a handful of things the cameras had genuinely no interest in, private corners of her existence that managed to remain genuinely unobserved throughout the years. In a small but real sense, these quiet hobbies functioned as private acts of rebellion. Essentially everything else in her adult life was carefully scheduled, publicly judged, and consciously performed for an ever-present audience. But these particular activities belonged to her alone, made entirely with her own hands, answerable to absolutely no palace committee, subject to no formal protocol whatsoever, requiring no one else's approval before she pursued them. She did not press flowers because some unwritten rule suggested a proper princess ought to. She pressed them, quite simply, because she genuinely wanted to. In a world that had, in a real sense, claimed nearly every other part of her identity and time, the simple private assertion of one purely personal pleasure functioned as its own quiet, meaningful declaration of continued independence. And it was specifically within those genuinely unwatched private hours that the real, unguarded grace could continue to exist at all. Not the flawless public princess, not the radiant national symbol, not the gracious hostess reliably performing warmth on a fixed public schedule, but the actual living woman underneath all of that public performance, genuinely curious, authentically creative, drawn naturally toward beauty and quiet and the patient, careful making of small, lovely things. She was, it turns out on closer examination, a little unconventional in her private tastes, a person of genuine, specific personal preferences that had, in the end, remarkably little to do with crowns or titles of any kind. But the wider world had its own particular way of eventually turning even her most casual private choices into something approaching genuine legend. And one specific choice would go on to permanently attach her own personal name to an everyday object still carried by countless strangers, generation after generation, to this very day. Grace's broader influence on the world of fashion proved so genuinely profound over time that it eventually produced one of the truly enduring artifacts of 20th century style, a structured leather handbag, originally produced by the venerable French fashion house Hermes, that became so closely and consistently associated with her public image that the company itself eventually renamed the bag directly in her honor. It became known, from that point forward, simply as the Kelly bag. It represents a small, genuinely strange kind of lasting immortality, that a woman who had once won an Academy Award and later married a reigning prince should also, decades later, be remembered on a daily basis every single time someone casually reaches for a particular style of handbag. But it speaks clearly to just how completely and thoroughly Grace came to embody a certain widely recognized ideal of timeless elegance. She did not simply wear fashionable items well. She gradually became, over time, a permanent cultural reference point for an entire aesthetic. The underlying story behind the bag itself is almost too neatly perfect to be genuinely true, and yet it is. The House of Hermes had, for some years, already produced a particular structured leather handbag. Elegant, refined, the sort of accessory that had already accumulated its own dedicated following among knowledgeable fashion enthusiasts. Grace personally favored this particular bag, carried it regularly, and it gradually became a recognizable part of her overall public look. Then, in one of those largely accidental moments that end up quietly outliving their original circumstances, she was photographed on one particular occasion using the bag specifically to shield herself, holding it deliberately up in front of her body to help conceal or protect herself from the ever-present pursuing cameras. The resulting photograph circulated widely. The association stuck firmly in the public imagination, and the specific bag she had used in that moment to hide from the very press that constantly pursued her became, from that point forward, permanently and publicly linked to the most photographed woman alive anywhere in the world at that time. So thoroughly did that particular association take hold that the company itself eventually formally renamed the bag in her direct honor. What had previously been, quite simply, one fine handbag among several offered by the house became, from that point onward, specifically the Kelly bag, named directly after the princess, whose casual use had made it internationally famous, and it has carried that particular name continuously ever since. Decades later, it remains one of the most genuinely coveted and instantly recognizable objects in the entire world of high fashion, actively sought after, frequently imitated by other designers, and immediately recognizable at a glance to millions of people who could not necessarily name a single one of her actual films. There is something genuinely strange about this particular, specific form of lasting fame. Grace Kelly achieved, across her lifetime, a genuinely considerable number of things. She won the very highest professional honor available in her original field. She married directly into one of Europe's oldest and most storied royal houses. She personally secured an entire dynasty's continued future, actively championed the arts throughout Monaco, and charmed a genuinely global audience for decades. And yet, one of the specific ways she remains most enduringly remembered today, encountered daily by countless people who could not name a single one of her films, happens to be through a simple leather purse. Every single time someone casually reaches for a Kelly bag, they are, in effect, quietly invoking her memory, whether they happen to consciously realize it or not. But look past the underlying strangeness of it for a moment, and the bag itself reveals something genuinely real about who she had become within the world's collective imagination. It was not named after her purely by marketing accident. It was named after her specifically because she so completely and consistently embodied one particular ideal, a cool, refined, seemingly effortless elegance that an entire surrounding culture instinctively recognized, and in many cases, actively aspired toward. She was not merely a woman who happened to wear beautiful clothing well. She had become, over time, the actual standard against which comparably beautiful things came to be measured, the fixed reference point, the practical definition of a certain specific kind of grace, understood in essentially every sense of that particular word. That represents a genuinely rare kind of lasting cultural influence. Plenty of famous individuals throughout history have been widely admired in their own time. Very few of them ever become the permanent measuring stick for an entire aesthetic category. The specific name a major fashion house instinctively reaches for whenever it wants to convey timeless and elegant in a single recognizable word. Grace clearly crossed that particular threshold. She did not simply participate in fashion during her lifetime. She became, in a lasting sense, one of its fixed cultural stars, a genuine point of orientation that the entire fashion world continues, even now, to quietly navigate by. An Academy Award, a genuine crown, an ancient dynasty, and now a globally recognized handbag. It amounts, taken together, to a genuinely peculiar list of lasting legacies. And it all belonged to a woman whose immediate family, meanwhile, was still actively growing, with one further child yet to arrive and complete it. In 1965, after a considerable gap of several years, Grace gave birth to her third and ultimately final child, a second daughter named Stephanie, and her arrival brought with it a noticeably softer, warmer emotional energy to the entire royal family. With the earlier, more urgent pressures surrounding dynastic succession now long since fully satisfied, this particular birth represented motherhood genuinely freed from any lingering sense of formal national duty, and Grace, by all accounts, embraced the experience fully. By this later point in her life, she had settled considerably more completely into her adopted role, felt noticeably more secure and confident within her adopted world, even as she continued, quietly, to guard certain private longings that had never entirely faded away over the years. The three Grimaldi children collectively became one of the deepest, most genuine focuses of her heart throughout these years. Whatever the surrounding palace life had failed to provide her in terms of personal freedom, her immediate family provided her, in real and substantial measure, with genuine meaning. And she was, above essentially every formal title she carried, by every credible account, a deeply devoted and consistently attentive mother. The considerable gap in timing between her children matters here in understanding the emotional difference. Caroline and Albert had arrived in fairly quick succession, back to back, during those frantic early years when the dynasty urgently needed continuity secured, and when the entire watching country had closely followed each of Grace's pregnancies specifically for signs regarding the family's future. Stephanie, by contrast, arrived years later, well after all of that earlier dynastic pressure had already been fully and permanently resolved, and that fundamental difference in circumstance changed essentially everything about the surrounding experience. This was clearly not a birth the nation was anxiously awaiting in order to secure its own political future. This was, quite simply, a family welcoming a new child for no reason beyond genuine love, and that reality freed the entire experience of its earlier accumulated weight. When Caroline had been born, the surrounding joy had been genuinely real, but also quietly shadowed by the still unfinished business of securing the succession. When Albert arrived, there had been real, palpable relief, the ceremonial cannons, the collective national exhale of a dynasty now finally secured. But Stephanie was born into none of that particular surrounding weight. The male heir was already long since firmly in place, the family's future already fully assured, the essential formal obligations already completely met, so her arrival could genuinely be pure, largely uncomplicated happiness. Motherhood, in this specific instance, was experienced not primarily as a matter of state business, but as a genuinely private personal blessing. For once in her royal life, Grace simply got to have a baby purely because she was, at her core, a mother, not because she happened, additionally, to be a princess carrying an active duty to perform. And by this particular point in her life, she was, in real and meaningful ways, a genuinely different woman than the anxious, uncertain newcomer of roughly a decade earlier. The intervening years had settled her considerably. She had thoroughly mastered the language, the customs, the seemingly endless formal demands of her adopted role. She had grown noticeably more sure of herself over time, considerably more comfortable moving through her adopted world, even as she continued quietly guarding the specific private longings that had never entirely faded from her inner life. The particular rawness of those first overwhelming years had gradually given way to something noticeably steadier and more settled. She clearly knew, by this stage, exactly who she was within this life she had chosen, and she could now meet a new child from a place of genuine confidence rather than earlier uncertainty or fear. Motherhood, in fact, became one of the genuine central anchors of her entire adult existence. The three Grimaldi children stood among the deepest, most genuine focuses of her heart throughout these years, the specific part of her royal life that consistently felt least like an ongoing public performance and most like unfiltered personal truth. Whatever the surrounding palace life had ultimately failed to provide her, whatever specific personal freedoms the crown had genuinely cost her over the years, her own children gave her something the wider fairy tale itself had never been able to offer: genuine, entirely unscripted meaning. Within the nursery, and later around the family dinner table, she was never simply a public symbol or a valuable national asset. She was, quite simply, their mother, and she was, by essentially every credible account available, a genuinely devoted and consistently attentive one, deeply and personally involved in her children's individual lives in a way that clearly mattered enormously to her. Above all the accumulated titles, honors, and glittering formal obligations that came with her position, this particular identity was, by most accounts, the one she personally held most dearly of all. But raising genuinely royal children, especially while bringing the fierce, hands-on instincts of an American mother into a considerably more formal European court setting, would prove to be its own complicated, ongoing adventure, one that did not always unfold according to plan. Raising royal children within a European court, while carrying the distinctly American parenting instincts she had grown up with herself, amounted to its own delicate, ongoing balancing act throughout these years. Grace clearly wanted her children to maintain a certain groundedness that she genuinely feared the surrounding palace environment might otherwise strip away from them entirely. And she could be notably firm, protective, and hands-on within an environment that generally expected royal offspring to be handed off largely to professional household staff for their day-to-day care. She worried, quite openly at times, about the potentially corrosive effects of extreme privilege on young developing people. She worked actively to instill genuine discipline and a sense of normalcy in her children's upbringing, and she fretted, as essentially any devoted parent does, over their eventual futures. But she was also, simultaneously, raising all three of them inside a kind of fishbowl, where their every stumble and misstep would eventually, inevitably, become genuinely public. The underlying tension between the fundamentally ordinary mother she personally wanted to be and the extraordinarily exposed public lives her children had been born directly into would end up following all three of them for a great many years afterward. The underlying clash of parenting cultures was, in a real sense, built directly into the surrounding situation from the start. European royal tradition had, over centuries, developed well-established expectations regarding exactly how princes and princesses ought to be raised. Expectations that generally involved a considerable degree of delegation to professional nannies, tutors, and household staff, along with a certain formal, expected distance maintained between royal parents and their own children. Grace, shaped fundamentally by her own American upbringing and instincts, wanted something considerably more hands-on, more personally involved, more closely resembling the engaged, present style of parenting she genuinely believed in. She was clearly not content simply to hand her children off to be raised primarily by household staff, seeing them only at formally scheduled intervals throughout the day. She wanted, quite deliberately, to be genuinely present and actively involved in their upbringing, in a manner that did not always neatly align with the established customs of the surrounding court. Underneath that general preference sat a real and quite specific underlying fear that palace life itself might, over time, genuinely ruin her children if left unchecked. She worried openly about the corrosive potential effects of extraordinary wealth and elevated social status, about the particular way that this kind of privilege can, left unchallenged, gradually hollow out a young developing person, breeding entitlement and a dangerous detachment from ordinary reality. She had, after all, grown up herself within a demanding household, where genuine achievement was consistently expected, rather than simply assumed, where nothing of real value was ever simply handed over without effort. And some real part of her clearly wanted her own children to carry forward that same underlying sense of groundedness, that same practical understanding that the wider world did not exist purely to serve their personal convenience. So she consistently pushed, throughout their childhoods, for real discipline, for a genuine sense of normalcy, for an overall sense of proportion, actively trying to raise decent, well-anchored human beings within what remained one of the most genuinely rarefied environments anywhere on Earth. This made her, by the general standards of her immediate surroundings, a notably firm and protective mother. She remained consistently involved, watchful, and entirely unafraid to set clear boundaries with her children, worrying over their individual development and their eventual futures with all the ordinary intensity any devoted parent naturally brings to the task. In this particular respect, she comes across as deeply, genuinely relatable. Strip away the surrounding palace entirely, and what remains is simply a mother actively worrying about spoiling her own children, working hard to instill good underlying values, genuinely anxious about how they will each eventually turn out as adults. It stands as one of the most universally recognizable struggles that exists anywhere, simply conducted, in this particular case, within an actual castle rather than an ordinary suburban home. But there was a real cruelty built directly into the surrounding setup that no amount of genuinely good parenting could ever fully solve on its own. She was raising these 3 children inside a literal fishbowl. Every individual choice they made, every ordinary childhood stumble, every act of typical teenage rebellion, every entirely normal mistake made while simply growing up, would eventually become genuinely public knowledge, closely dissected by the very same relentless international press that had already spent years closely cataloging their own mother's weight and wardrobe choices. Ordinary children everywhere generally get to make their own inevitable mistakes in reasonable privacy, to be occasionally awkward, foolish, or genuinely reckless without an attentive audience watching closely. Her own children did not have access to that particular luxury. Their entire process of coming of age was destined to become, in effect, a genuine spectator sport for a global audience. So the underlying tension proved permanent and ultimately unresolvable throughout their childhoods. Grace clearly wanted to raise ordinary, well-grounded, genuinely well-adjusted people. And she was actively trying to accomplish exactly that within a surrounding life that was, by its very nature, anything but ordinary, one where genuine privacy simply did not meaningfully exist, and where the entire watching world felt broadly entitled to observe. The underlying gap between the specific kind of mother she genuinely wanted to be and the extraordinarily exposed public lives her children had been born directly into, would go on to shadow the entire family for a great many years to come. And as her 2 daughters gradually grew into increasingly independent young women, that particular gap would only continue widening into something the international tabloid press could hardly wait to eagerly photograph and report on. Alongside all of this ongoing family complexity, another quiet pressure was steadily mounting throughout these same years, one aimed not primarily at her growing children, but directly at Grace herself, and specifically at the very thing that had originally made her famous in the first place. Grace had become genuinely famous, early in her career, for a very particular kind of youthful, cool blonde beauty and time itself, as it inevitably does to absolutely everyone eventually, would eventually ask her to let go of that specific image entirely, in full, unforgiving public view. She aged naturally, as everyone does. Her figure gradually changed over the years, as bodies naturally do. And the very same international press that had once thoroughly worshipped her apparent flawlessness now began noting every small visible change with considerably less kind attention than before. For a woman whose entire public identity had been built, from the very beginning, around simply being looked at and admired, this particular passage of life proved uniquely difficult to navigate. She faced it, by most credible accounts, with considerably more genuine grace than most people could have managed under similar circumstances, deliberately leaning into her private interests, her close family relationships, and her ongoing artistic work rather than fixating anxiously on her own changing reflection. But the underlying pressure of having grown up, and subsequently grown older, as a living public symbol of supposed perfection was entirely real, and it clearly took a quiet, largely invisible toll that the smiling public photographs of the era never actually revealed to outside observers. The underlying trap, in a real sense, had been set the very moment she first became famous. Grace had built her entire public identity around one very specific, luminous image: the cool, seemingly flawless, distinctly youthful blonde, functioning as the very definition of a certain widely recognized kind of beauty. That particular image became her personal signature, the specific thing the wider world had come to adore, and over time, had quietly come to expect from her indefinitely. But any public image permanently frozen at its original peak eventually becomes a kind of debt that time inevitably arrives to collect in full. You simply cannot remain 26 years old forever, no matter how carefully you manage your public image. And the more completely any given public fame happens to rest specifically on youthful perfection, the more genuinely brutal the eventual reckoning tends to be once the passing years inevitably arrive regardless. And arrive they eventually did, exactly as they do for every single human being who has ever lived on this earth. Grace aged naturally, as everyone must. Her figure gradually changed over time, as most people's bodies naturally do. The face and body that had once been publicly held up as an almost impossible standard of physical perfection simply became, over time, ordinarily older, in the completely universal way that happens to absolutely everyone eventually. There is, viewed objectively, nothing remotely remarkable about this basic process. It represents, arguably, the single most common human experience that exists anywhere. What was genuinely uncommon, in her particular case, was the sheer size of the surrounding audience. Most people are fortunate enough to grow older in relative privacy, their gradual physical changes noticed only by the small circle of people who happen to be closest to them personally. Grace grew older instead in front of essentially the entire watching world, with cameras trained steadily on her the whole way through. The very same press that had once thoroughly worshipped her turned, as the press so often eventually does, to instead noting every visible change with considerably less kind attention than before. The very same publications that had originally built her up as the absolute paragon of flawless physical beauty now openly cataloged her natural weight changes, her ordinary aging process, every small departure from the genuinely impossible original standard that those same publications had themselves originally helped establish in the first place. There is a particular, specific cruelty involved in being widely adored specifically for one's youth, and then subsequently criticized for gradually losing it, almost as though the entirely natural process of growing older represented some kind of personal failure of will, rather than simply the basic, unavoidable condition of remaining alive. Grace, who had spent literal decades being closely looked at and admired, now had to additionally endure being looked at with a more openly critical eye, consistently measured against an earlier version of herself that, by this point, no longer existed and, realistically, could never have lasted indefinitely in the first place. For someone whose entire adult life had been organized so completely around outward physical appearance, this particular passage proved genuinely difficult to navigate gracefully. Her considerable natural beauty had functioned, for years, as her professional calling card, her protective armor, her practical currency within both Hollywood and royal life, and watching the wider world respond somewhat unkindly to its entirely natural gradual fatting struck directly at something fairly central to her sense of self. This was clearly not simple vanity on her part. It represented, more accurately, the genuine disorientation experienced by a person whose carefully constructed public self had become so thoroughly bound up with conventional physical beauty that its inevitable, universal change felt, at some level, like an actual personal loss. But she met this particular challenge, characteristically, with considerably more genuine grace than most people could likely have managed in her position. Rather than waging some kind of desperate, ultimately doomed personal war against the ordinary passage of time, she instead deliberately leaned into the things in her life that did not fundamentally depend on maintaining a youthful face: her private interests, her pressed flowers and her poetry, her close family relationships, her ongoing artistic patronage work. She found her sense of underlying personal worth increasingly in what she actually did, and in who she genuinely loved, rather than continuing to search for it primarily in her own mirror, deliberately redirecting her core sense of self toward considerably more durable, lasting ground. It represented, in the end, a quietly wise and mature response to what was, by any measure, a genuinely difficult and largely unavoidable situation. Still, the underlying personal toll involved was entirely real, even though the consistently smiling public photographs from this period never once fully revealed it to outside observers. She carried, privately, the considerable weight of having grown visibly older as a living public monument to an impossible standard of perfection, and nobody, realistically, carries that particular burden lightly or without cost. She was, in these final years of her life, quietly learning how to become someone the original fairy tale had never actually imagined in its telling. Not the flawless young princess of the wedding photographs, but a fuller, considerably deeper, genuinely aging woman, navigating that transition with real, quiet dignity, right up until the entirely ordinary afternoon that would, without warning, bring everything to an end. On the 13th of September 1982, Grace was driving down the steep, winding mountain roads that descend from the hills above Monaco, with her youngest daughter, Stephanie, seated beside her in the passenger seat. Somewhere along that particularly treacherous stretch of coastal road, something went catastrophically, irreversibly wrong. The car left the roadway entirely and plunged down a steep embankment below. Stephanie survived the crash. Grace, gravely injured, did not. She died the following day, at the age of 52. It is now widely believed, based on later medical assessment, that she may have suffered a stroke at the wheel, a small, entirely invisible failure somewhere deep inside her own body that brought one of the most closely watched public lives of the entire century to an abrupt and permanent end in a matter of seconds. The fairy tale did not fade out gently, the way fairy tales are generally supposed to. It ended suddenly, on an entirely ordinary road, on an entirely ordinary afternoon, in precisely the abrupt, unscripted way real life so often and so cruelly tends to unfold. There had been nothing remarkable whatsoever about that particular morning. She was simply driving, making the familiar trip down from the family's country retreat in the hills back toward the palace in Monaco, with her teenage daughter beside her in the car. It was the sort of routine, everyday journey she had surely made countless times over the years, a road she knew intimately, on a day that resembled any number of ordinary days that had come before it. This is, in fact, how genuine catastrophe most often actually arrives in real life, not with any advance warning or dramatic build-up, but quietly disguised as nothing more than an unremarkable errand on an entirely unremarkable afternoon. The roads themselves in that particular part of the world were genuinely treacherous by any objective standard, steep, tightly serpentine, carved directly into the mountainside high above the principality, marked throughout by sharp blind turns and unforgiving sheer drops on one side. These were the famous, winding coastal roads of the region, celebrated for their beauty and simultaneously notorious for their danger, the kind of roads that demand a driver's complete, undivided attention at every moment, and that punish even a momentary lapse severely and without mercy. Somewhere along that particular descent, in a moment that nobody else fully witnessed or could later fully reconstruct, Control of the vehicle was lost, and the car left the roadway entirely, going over the edge and plunging down the steep embankment below. Stephanie, in the passenger seat, survived the crash. She was seriously injured in the accident, but she lived. Grace did not survive. Gravely injured in the impact, she was rushed to a nearby hospital, and she died there the following day, on the 14th of September, at only 52 years of age. A life that had been watched closely, in real time, by more people than perhaps any other single life during that entire century came to its end quietly, in a hospital bed, as the direct result of one single catastrophic afternoon on a familiar mountain road she had driven many times before without incident. What makes the entire event feel especially haunting, even decades later, is the growing medical belief regarding its underlying cause. It is now widely believed that Grace may well have suffered a sudden stroke while actually driving, a silent, entirely invisible failure occurring somewhere deep inside her own body that effectively took the critical decision completely out of her hands in that final moment. If that assessment is accurate, then the resulting accident was never really an accident of careless driving at all, but rather the tragic external consequence of something going silently, catastrophically wrong within her own physical body. A small, hidden biological betrayal that ultimately steered a woman who had spent her entire adult life carefully controlling essentially every visible aspect of her public image directly off a familiar road she had known and safely navigated for years. There is a genuinely terrible irony embedded in that particular detail, that a life so thoroughly defined by careful, disciplined control should ultimately end through a sudden loss of control that she could not possibly have anticipated or prevented, no matter how skilled or careful a driver she may have been. And so the fairy tale, in the end, did not receive anything resembling the gentle, satisfying ending that fairy tales are conventionally supposed to receive. There was no gradual fade, no peaceful conclusion arriving naturally after a long and full life, no soft, gentle closing chapter allowing for proper anticipation or farewell. There was, instead, a sudden, violent, essentially senseless accident on an entirely ordinary road, and a genuinely remarkable woman gone at only 52 years old, decades before what should reasonably have been her time. It was not, in any real sense, simply the symbolic death of a distant legend. It was, more fundamentally and more painfully, the death of an actual person, abrupt, deeply unfair, in precisely the way that real deaths, stripped of any narrative convenience, so often genuinely are. The wider world, which had watched her original wedding unfold via television with tens of millions of viewers, and had closely followed her every subsequent public move for well over 2 decades, now received news it could scarcely quite believe or fully process. The princess was gone. The beautiful, disciplined, genuinely complicated woman who had once given up an entire flourishing acting career specifically to become a living public symbol had died. In the end, the way essentially anyone might die, on an ordinary road, on an ordinary afternoon, without any meaningful advance warning whatsoever. And the morning that followed in the days ahead would demonstrate, with real clarity, just how deeply and genuinely she had lodged herself in the collective imagination of people all around the world. Grace's funeral drew genuine, widespread grief from around the entire world to that very same small cathedral where she had originally married some 26 years earlier, and the resulting outpouring of mourning proved to be entirely sincere and genuinely global in scope. She was ultimately laid to rest within the Grimaldi family vault, in the small country she had, in a very real sense, given up absolutely everything to properly serve. But her broader public story, notably, refused to simply end there with her burial. In the many decades since her death, Grace Kelly has, if anything, only continued growing larger within the world's collective popular imagination, remembered simultaneously as both the radiant Hollywood film star of her earlier years and the elegant, genuinely complicated European princess of her later life. Her lasting legacy continues living on today in the various charitable foundations established in her name, in the ongoing world of fashion, in periodic film retrospectives revisiting her earlier screen work, and in the persistent, enduring popular myth of the beautiful American girl who once married a real prince. Tonight, though, across these several hours together, we have tried instead to look carefully past that enduring myth, toward the actual complicated woman who lived quietly inside it the entire time, genuinely talented, remarkably disciplined, frequently homesick, deeply devoted to her family, and above every title she ever carried, thoroughly, recognizably human. The fairy tale itself, as we have seen throughout tonight's story, was in the end always the single least interesting thing about her. The underlying symmetry of her story's ending is almost unbearably poignant when you sit with it directly. Her funeral was held in that very same cathedral where, some 26 years earlier, she had once stood in her now legendary lace wedding gown and formally married her prince, watched at the time by an estimated 30 million people around the world. The very same historic building that had originally hosted the joyful beginning of her particular fairy tale now hosted, decades later, its final, sorrowful ending. The very same ancient stones that had once witnessed the celebrated wedding of the century now witnessed the genuine, widespread grief of a world that had, against most reasonable expectation, come over the years to feel that it genuinely knew her personally. And that grief, notably, was entirely genuine throughout, not the somewhat hollow, manufactured mourning that sometimes surrounds the death of a distant celebrity, but something considerably deeper and more widely shared than that. People who had never once met her personally nonetheless felt her loss on a genuinely personal level, because she had remained a consistent fixture of the collective public imagination for so many years running, a familiar presence quietly woven into the broader popular culture of an entire era. She was buried within the Grimaldi family vault, taking her permanent, final place among the ancient dynasty she had formally joined so many years earlier, within the small country for which she had ultimately given up her original acting career, a considerable measure of her personal freedom, and in many real ways her earlier sense of self, in order to properly serve it. She had become, by the end, fully and completely a Grimaldi in her own right. But her death, notably, did not diminish her lasting cultural presence. If anything, it had precisely the opposite effect over time. In the decades since her passing, Grace Kelly has only continued to grow larger within the world's collective memory, occupying a genuinely rare double position within popular culture, remembered forever as the radiant Hollywood star of her earlier film career, and remembered simultaneously, and just as vividly, as the elegant, complicated princess of her second, entirely different life. Most well-known public figures are remembered, if they are remembered at all, for a single defining achievement or role. She is remembered vividly, and in considerable detail, for two entirely separate, extraordinary lives, each remarkable in its own right, joined together permanently at the genuinely improbable hinge point of a single fairy tale wedding. Her lasting legacy today flows outward through a great many different channels. It lives on in the various charitable foundations that continue to carry her name forward, sustaining her original devotion to nurturing young, emerging artists. It lives on within the world of fashion, in the handbag that continues to bear her name, and in the particular timeless elegance she came, over time, to publicly define. It lives on in periodic film retrospectives that continue keeping her earlier screen performances genuinely alive for entirely new generations of viewers, many of whom discover, often with real and pleasant surprise, just how genuinely skilled a performer she actually was during her Hollywood years. And perhaps above everything else, it lives on within the enduring popular myth itself, the story of the beautiful American girl who once married a European prince, which remains, even now, one of the most consistently powerful fairy tales the modern world has ever told itself, repeated and reshared across each successive generation. And yet that particular myth, for all of its remarkable staying power across the decades, was always, in the end, only the shallowest possible version of who she actually was. Tonight, across these several hours together, we have tried instead to reach past that familiar myth in order to find the actual, complicated woman who lived quietly inside the surrounding story the entire time. Talented and genuinely disciplined, certainly, but also frequently homesick, at times genuinely lonely, fiercely and consistently devoted to her 3 children, quietly rebellious in her own small way through her private pressed flowers and her love of poetry, navigating the difficult process of aging under a consistently unforgiving public gaze, and above every other single thing, thoroughly and recognizably human. Not simply a distant public symbol, not merely a glossy postcard image. A genuine, complicated person, because that particular realization is, in the end, the real revelation sitting quietly at the very heart of her entire life story. The fairy tale itself was lovely, and it was genuinely famous around the world, and it was, when you look closely enough, ultimately the single least interesting thing about her as an actual human being. The genuinely interesting part was always the real woman who lived quietly inside that story, along with everything the familiar storybook version conveniently chose to leave out entirely. So that, then, was the fairy tale, with all of its soft, flattering focus quietly wiped carefully away. A young woman standing at the very top of her professional world, who nonetheless gave up the demanding career she had personally fought so hard to build, crossed an entire ocean, learned a completely new language from scratch, and folded herself, piece by piece, into an ancient European dynasty perched on a small rock above the sea. She traded genuine public applause for quiet, unglamorous duty, traded personal freedom for a physical crown, and traded the simple, ordinary pleasure of a single, unwatched private afternoon for an entire lifetime spent being constantly, relentlessly looked at by others. She learned, through years of quiet effort, to appear entirely flawless within an unfamiliar foreign court, successfully secured an entire nation's uncertain future, gradually charmed a genuinely skeptical world, and raised her own 3 children inside a literal fishbowl of constant public attention, all the while quietly, privately aching for an original home she could, realistically, never fully return to again. And through absolutely all of it, she endured with a genuine grace that extended, in real and meaningful ways, considerably beyond her own famous name. She found small, private refuges for herself wherever she reasonably could, in carefully pressed flowers and quiet poetry, in her sustained patronage of the arts she deeply loved, in the close family she genuinely adored above all else. She carried a persistent, private loneliness with real personal dignity, and she consistently answered an almost impossible public role with quiet, stubborn personal resilience. Night after night, gala after gala, practice smile after practice smile, for the better part of 3 full decades. So tonight, as you settle comfortably into your own bed, within your own quiet room, carrying the simple, genuinely unglamorous freedom to be entirely and completely yourself, unwatched and entirely unjudged by anyone, perhaps take a moment to spare a gentle private thought for the real woman who lived quietly behind that famous tiara. Not the familiar postcard image, not the enduring popular myth, but the actual, complicated person underneath both, someone whose real, complicated story quietly reminds us that even the most outwardly golden life imaginable still carries its own genuinely heavy hours, and that being ordinary and being free is, in its own quiet way, its own particular kind of treasure worth genuinely appreciating. Because in the end, the fairy tale itself was never really the actual point of the story. The real, complicated person living quietly inside it always was. Rest easy now. Let the palace lights fade gently. Let the distant cameras finally fall silent. And let the winding mountain roads and the glittering sea far below them slowly fade softly away into the quiet dark. Sleep well. We'll be here again tomorrow night with another story to carry you gently through the hours until morning.